The trail was little more than a scar across the Wyoming high country, a thin line of churned mud and snow that cut through the timber like a half-forgotten wound. The mountains rose indifferent on all sides, their peaks lost in a haze of approaching storm clouds. Travis Blackwood moved along that trail with the slow weariness of someone who had nothing left to rush toward. He was lean, gaunt, almost his face darkened by sun and wind until it looked carved from rawhide. A dust-grimed coat hung from his shoulders, patched more times than he cared to count, and the brim of his straw hat had long since frayed to tatters. His boots left shallow prints in the frozen ruts, and every step sounded hollow, as if the ground beneath him no longer cared to hold his weight. Beside him walked a Mustang, the color of thunderclouds, black with hints of stormy gray, where the light caught his coat. Spirit was his name, though the horse answered only with flicks of his ears and the slow, patient exhale of a creature that had seen too many hard miles. He carried no saddle that day, just a rope halter and the faint white scar of an old wound across his flank, a jagged line that matched the one hidden beneath Travis's shirt. Afghanistan had marked them both. The pair of them, man and horse, might have looked like ghosts left wandering after the war, shadows half forgotten by the living. Travis carried little, a canvas sack with a few nails, a hatchet, and a long-bladed knife hung from his belt. No wagon, no family, no trailing companions. Everything else had been lost or sold piece by piece until only this remained. They trudged on the sound of their passing, muffled by snow. For a long time, Travis didn't speak. He rarely did anymore. But as the trail narrowed between walls of pine, he reached out, fingers brushing the horse's neck, and muttered in a voice gone gravel rough from years of smoke and shouting, "Far as we've come, Spirit. Reckon there's no turning back now. You see it, don't you?" The Mustang's ears swiveled, catching the words. He gave a short, weary snort as if in answer, and the two pressed on. Wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of a bitter night ahead. Travis pulled his coat tighter, the fabric stiff with old sweat and older memories. His joints ached from the cold, but the pain was familiar now, almost welcome. It reminded him he was still alive, still moving, though, toward what he couldn't say. It was late afternoon when they came through a stand of old timber. The pines leaned like sentinels, their tops lost in fog, and beneath them the snow was mottled with patches of dead grass. Travis pushed forward, head bent, until suddenly the trees fell away and he found himself standing in a clearing. At its center, squatting like a relic from another life, was the cabin. Even at a distance, he could see how far it had fallen. The roof sagged, half the shingles missing, with wide gaps where daylight speared through. One wall had given up entirely, leaning outward, as though trying to escape its own weight. The front door clung to a single rusted hinge, slapping weakly in the wind, while the porch was littered with weeds and the bones of some small animal that had crawled there to die. Moss climbed the chimney stones. The place smelled of mildew and long abandonment. Travis stopped. For a moment he simply stood, chest rising and falling, watching the ruin as though it were some apparition conjured from the fog of his exhaustion. His breath ghosted in the cold air. His hands, scarred and calloused, tightened on the rope that held Spirit. The Mustang shook himself, snow sliding from his back, and stepped closer to the porch. His movements were deliberate, unlike his usual caution around structures. Spirit lowered his head, blowing steam across the frozen ground. Then, as if making his own choice, he stepped to the porch post and rubbed his forehead against the weathered wood. The gesture was plain as spoken words. This would do. This would be home, if they could make it so. Travis drew in a long breath that stung his lungs, then let it out in a rough sigh. "Just you and me, Spirit," he murmured. "But maybe that's enough to start again." The horse lowered his head, blowing steam across the frozen ground. Travis eased the door open, the wood moaning like some half-awake beast. The hinges shrieked, and the panel banged against the wall, sending a spray of dust into the air. He ducked inside. The floor groaned beneath his boots. Once long ago, someone had lived here. He could feel it. A stone fireplace still stood at the far wall, its bricks dark with old soot, though part of it had collapsed inward. Splinters of what had been a table lay scattered across the planks, gnawed by mice. Webs drooped thick from the rafters, swaying in the draft that poured through every crack. He ran a hand across the wall. The wood flaked away beneath his fingers. Near the corner, he spotted something carved into the beam, crude lines forming the shape of a bull's skull. Beside it, faint, half-burned letters, J, the rest lost to fire or rot. Whoever they were, their mark had outlived them. Travis dropped his sack to the floor and crouched by the hearth. Beneath a mound of ash, he found a few scraps of charcoal and, deeper still, a clutch of brittle twigs. He gathered them into a pile, struck sparks with his knife and flint, and coaxed a weak flame to life. The smoke clawed its way up the ruined chimney, leaking back into the room in pale ribbons. By the time the fire held, his eyes stung from the haze. Still, it was warmth, and the first he had felt since morning. He spread an old deer hide he'd found in the corner, knocking moss and mildew away, and sat heavily upon it. His body ached from the miles, but he forced himself to look around the room again. It was broken, yes, but it was standing, and maybe that was enough. Spirit lingered just outside the door. Head lowered, ears pricked. The horse stood watch while the man warmed his hands over the fragile flame. Wind hissed through the gaps in the wall, carrying the damp smell of rot, and a loneliness so thick Travis felt it press against his skin. Darkness came quickly in the pines. The fire burned low, throwing red light against the beams, but it could not keep the cold from creeping through every seam. Travis lay on the floor with his army blanket pulled to his chin, staring up at the ragged holes in the roof, where stars flickered like indifferent eyes. The wind rose. It howled across the clearing, rattling the broken shutters. Dust fell from the ceiling, beams fine as ash settling into his hair. He closed his eyes, trying to will sleep, but the silence carried too much memory. A crack rang out beyond the tree line, a sharp splitting noise, wood on wood. Travis shot upright, heart hammering. For an instant, he wasn't in Wyoming at all. He was back on the rocky slopes outside Kandahar, the night torn apart by gunfire, horses screaming, men shouting in agony. His chest heaved, breath short and ragged, his hand jerked to his side as though to draw a pistol he no longer owned. No, no, not now, he muttered, voice shaking. Not here. His vision swam. The cabin blurred into the image of a battlefield. Smoke flamed, the smell of blood thick in the air. He pressed his fists against his temples, trying to force it away. And then he felt something warm, solid, pressing against his shoulder. He flinched, turned his head, and saw Spirit. The Mustang had stepped inside, silent as shadow, and now stood close, dark eyes fixed upon him. There was no judgment there, no fear, only steady presence. Travis swallowed hard. His chest still heaved, but the trembling slowed as he raised a shaking hand and laid it against the horse's neck. Heat pulsed beneath the skin, strong and alive. He closed his eyes and leaned into it. "You're as stubborn as I am," he whispered hoarsely. "God help me, I'm glad you're here, Spirit." The horse lowered himself awkwardly to the floor, folding his legs until he rested beside the man. He didn't move again. Didn't need to. The weight of his body, the sound of his breathing were enough. Travis let out a broken laugh, rough and half sobbing, but it eased something in his chest. He pulled the blanket tighter, pressed his forehead against Spirit's coarse mane, and for the first time in a long while, sleep found him. Outside, the wind still cried through the forest. But inside the ruin, for one fragile night, there was company, and that was enough. The morning came slow and pale, dragging itself over the mountains like an old dawn reluctant to rise. A dim band of light bled through the cracks in the cabin wall, turning the cold air into a haze of silver. Travis crouched at the hearth, blowing gently at the coals he had coaxed back to life from last night's embers. Each breath came in little clouds, white against the damp chill that clung to the boards. The fire gave a reluctant glow, crackling, as if resenting the demand to burn. He rubbed his hands, stretched stiff shoulders, and for a moment allowed himself the small comfort of flame. The cabin was no warmer than the forest beyond, but the ritual of tending fire steadied him. Then came a sound that pulled him upright, the steady rhythm of hooves. Spirit's ears pricked forward at once, nostrils flaring, and the Mustang gave a sharp snort. Travis rose slowly, brushing soot from his palms. Visitors were not common this deep in the pines. Visitors rarely meant peace. Through the frost-hazed doorway, he saw the figure emerge, an older man on horseback, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a long duster coat faded to the color of storm clouds. His hat brim was wide, shadowing a face carved by years of weather and authority. A star of tarnished brass glinted faintly on his chest. Sheriff Marshal Haynes. The sheriff reined in before the porch horse, stamping against the frost-stiff earth. For a moment, he simply looked at the cabin, at the sagging roof, the broken door, the smoke curling weakly from the chimney. His expression was unreadable. "Morning," Haynes called, voice steady as timber. Travis nodded once. "Sheriff?" The lawman reached into his saddlebag and drew out a small cloth sack tied shut with twine. He held it up without ceremony. Came across some mail at Dry Creek with your name on it. Figured you'd want it sooner than later. Travis stepped forward, boots crunching over frosted boards. He took the sack with a muttered word of thanks. Haynes studied him with a level gaze, neither mocking nor warm, but touched with something Travis couldn't quite name. Then the sheriff gave a curt nod, gathered his reins, and clicked his tongue. His horse moved off at a steady trot, disappearing down the trail without another word. Travis stood alone again. The wind pressed against his coat, tugged at the brim of his hat. After a moment, he sat down on the porch step, the wood sagging beneath him, and loosened the twine on the sack. Inside lay a scatter of envelopes, thin ones stamped with crude advertisements, notices from merchants, scraps of paper promising credit or collection. He shuffled through them without interest until his hand paused. A thicker envelope lay beneath the rest, its paper of pale ivory, the ink on its face written in a hand he knew too well. Soft, feminine strokes, curved letters. His breath stilled. Travis Blackwood. The words were enough to open a door inside his chest one he had fought to keep closed. For a long moment he simply stared, a thumb brushing the envelope's edge. Then, with a carefulness that betrayed the tremor in his hands, he broke the seal. Inside was a folded card, fine paper embossed with golden trim. He opened it, and the world narrowed to the words within. It was a wedding invitation. Jennifer's name shone in the neat script bound beside another, a man Travis had never met, though the name carried wealth in its cadence. Tucked inside the card was a photograph, small, sharp cruelty in its clarity. Jennifer standing beside a tall, broad man in a suit of tailored cloth. Her smile was full content. She looked complete. Travis's fingers tightened until the paper bent and wrinkled. His eyes lingered, tracing the line of her face, the familiar curve of her hair, now arranged with the care of a woman who had found a new life. At last he closed it, pressed the card between his palms until it crumpled. His voice slipped out in a whisper that carried no bitterness, only the weight of absence. "Congratulations, Jennifer." The words vanished into the wind. He sat very still, staring at the clearing beyond the porch. The trees swayed in the cold air, indifferent. Somewhere miles away, the sound of the sheriff's horse faded entirely. All that remained was the silence of a man left behind and the ruin he called shelter. For the first time since he arrived, the cabin felt like a coffin. He went back inside, the envelope clutched in one hand. He tossed the sack of mail aside and lowered himself to the floor, leaning against the wall, as if his bones could no longer hold him upright. The fire hissed and spat in the hearth, but its warmth failed to reach him. Travis's eyes fixed on nothing. His face was set, drawn into lines of stone. He had fought battles and buried friends. But this kind of loss carried no trumpet, no smoke, no blood. Just the slow erasure of whatever reason a man had to keep walking forward. Spirit shifted near the doorway. The horse had followed him inside, uninvited as always, but Travis did not protest. For a time, the Mustang stood motionless, ears flicking, gaze fixed on his master. Then, as if making some quiet decision, he stepped toward the far corner of the cabin, hooves striking hollow against the floorboards. The sound drew Travis's attention. He blinked, frowning, as Spirit pawed at the planks. Scraping noises filled the cabin, rhythmic and insistent. "What's got into you now?" Travis asked hoarsely. His voice was rough from disuse. Spirit didn't stop. He pawed harder, scraping away dust and straw until the wood beneath showed bare. Then he lifted his head, giving a sharp toss toward Travis, a signal clear as words. Travis pushed himself up, weariness heavy in his joints. He crossed to where the horse stood and knelt. Sure enough, the floor was uneven. Two boards met there with a seam finer than the rest, a line nearly hidden under grime. He ran his fingers along the crack, then pulled the knife from his belt. Its blade was dulled with age, but the steel still held. He worked it carefully between the planks. With a dry groan, the wood shifted. The board came loose without resistance. Beneath it was a shallow cavity lined with rotted cloth. Spirit snorted once and stepped back. Travis reached in. His hand brushed something solid. From the hollow, he drew two objects. The first was a Bible, its leather cover cracked and flaking corners worn soft by decades of hands. Dust clung to it, but the weight in his palm was unmistakable. The second was a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He laid it on the floor, fingers clumsy as he untied the stiff knots. Inside was a set of tools, A chisel, a knife, a ruler, each one shaped and polished by long use. On the wooden handle of the knife letters had been carved deep plain, but certain J. Blackwood, 1887. Travis sat back, heart thudding in his chest. Joseph Blackwood, his grandfather. He opened the Bible with reverence he had not shown in years. The pages were yellowed brittle at the edges, ink faded. But on the inside of the front cover, written in his grandfather's hand, a message had survived the decay of time. A house will only stand if it is built with faith and honest hands. Joseph Blackwood. The words struck like a hammer. Travis closed his eyes, the roughness of the paper beneath his fingertips dragging him backward in memory. He saw his grandfather's broad shoulders bent over a workbench, shaping boards into beds, beams, into barns. He remembered the smell of sawdust and the ring of tools, the quiet patience of a man who believed that every nail driven straight was an act of respect. For the craft, for the family, for himself. When he opened his eyes again, the cabin no longer looked like a tomb. Through the holes in the roof, he saw not ruin but frame, not rot but possibility. It was not a grave to crawl into. It was a skeleton waiting to be given flesh. He lifted the Bible once more, pressed it to his chest, and whispered, "I think I understand now, grandfather." The words steadied him. He rose, carried the tools outside, and stood on the porch. The morning had brightened the mist lifting off the trees. The wind still carried its bite, but it touched his face differently now. Not only as chill, but as breath, as movement. Spirit stood at the edge of the clearing, his hide catching the pale light. He turned his head, waiting. Travis walked to him, laid one hand against the warm curve of his neck, then reached with the other to the haft of the axe leaning by the wall. "We'll start with the roof, Spirit," he said, voice steady. "Not just to get by. We'll make it right. We'll make it ours." The Mustang flicked his tail. Travis raised the axe, and for the first time since he set foot on this land, the cabin seemed less a ruin and more a beginning. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the quiet 3 days later. Travis paused in his work, a hammer dangling from one hand, sweat cooling on his brow despite the cold. He'd been replacing rotted beams, working methodically from sunrise, and the sudden intrusion of engines felt alien in this forgotten place. Two horses emerged from the tree line, their riders bundled against the chill. Travis straightened, recognition dawning even at a distance. Sarah, his daughter, rode in front, straight back, chin tilted, with the stubborn pride she'd inherited from her mother. At 17, she carried herself like someone determined to be taken seriously. Behind her came Michael, 15 now, shoulders hunched inside his coat, his face partially hidden beneath a wool hat pulled low. Travis's chest tightened. He hadn't seen them in 8 months. Not since he'd left the rented house in town, unable to bear the walls closing in the nightmares that sent him thrashing and shouting in the darkness. Not since Jennifer had finally said enough. Sarah reined in her horse eyes, taking in the scene. The half-dismantled roof, the piles of rotted wood, the tools scattered across the porch. Her gaze finally settled on Travis himself, and something in her expression hardened. "Dad?" she called, voice carrying clear in the cold air. It wasn't a greeting so much as an acknowledgement. Travis set down his hammer, wiped his palms against his jeans. "Sarah, Michael, didn't expect to see you up here." Michael remained mounted, studying the cabin with open skepticism. His fingers tightened visibly around the reins, knuckles whitening. "Mom said you'd gone into the mountains. We thought," he stopped, jaw working. "We thought you'd lost your mind," Sarah finished for him, swinging down from her horse. She tied the reins to a pine stump and walked toward the cabin, boots crunching through patches of snow. "And looking at this place, I'm not convinced we were wrong." Travis watched her approach, suddenly aware of how he must appear. Unshaven clothes, stiff with sweat and sawdust, living in what most would consider little more than a collapsing shack. She stopped a few yards away, arms crossed tight against her chest. "This isn't a life, Dad," Sarah said, voice trembling between anger and worry. "This is a ruin." Her words cut deeper than any axe. Travis tried to answer with a smile, softening his voice, though it came out rough. "It was a ruin, but it isn't staying that way. I'm making it into something again. I have purpose here." Michael suddenly kicked free of his stirrups and dropped to the ground. He shoved his hands into his pockets, scowling at the piles of broken stone near the hearth. A loose brick rolled under his boot. He gave it a sharp kick, sending it skittering. "People are going to think you've lost your mind," he snapped. "Instead of coming back to Dry Creek, finding steady work like any sane man, you hide yourself here in the woods, patching up this shack." Travis gripped the hammer tighter, not from anger, but to steady the tremor in his hand. He looked at them both and saw not his children, but two young strangers, hard-eyed, wary, afraid of him. "You were babies last time I held you," he whispered. "Now you stand here like prosecutors." Sarah's expression softened, but only slightly. She lowered her gaze to the ground, then raised it again, her voice hushed, but laced with disappointment. "We worry for you, truly we do. You vanish from town, live out here alone, sleeping beside a horse in a broken cabin. How are we supposed to believe you're all right?" Michael's laugh was short and sharp. "You're not fixing anything. You're destroying what little was left of us." The words struck like a whip. Travis swallowed hard, throat burning. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching in the frost. His voice rasped, ragged but earnest. "You don't see it, but this place, it's saving me inch by inch." He gestured toward the roof beams above him. "Every cut of the stone, every nail I drive it quiets the noise. The gunfire, the screams, they fade. When I work, I can breathe again. Don't you understand? This is how I heal." For a moment, the clearing fell utterly still. Sarah looked down, her fingers twisting in her scarf. Michael, however, shifted his weight, turned his back slightly toward the cabin, and shook his head. "Other men came back from war," he said coldly. "They see doctors. They try to live like everyone else. You, you crawl into this forest like a madman and call it healing." Travis opened his mouth, but no words came. A wall had risen between them, one of silence, of generations of unspoken horrors. They had not seen what he had seen. They could not carry what he carried. And now, standing before them, he felt the distance like a canyon no bridge could span. His shoulders sagged, his hand slipped from the hammer's haft. A gust of wind swept through the clearing, rattling the half-framed roof. Spirit whickered low, lowering his head as though sensing the storm between them. Sarah gathered her reins, her voice low-pained. "We'll go back. But Father, if you need help, please don't put all your faith in a pile of wood." Michael had already swung into the saddle, his jaw tight, refusing to look at Travis. He dug his heels into his horse, turning sharply toward the road. Sarah lingered a moment longer, her eyes swimming with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "I miss you," she whispered, "but I don't know how to pull you out of this." Then she mounted, and in a spray of frost, the two horses carried them away, their silhouettes swallowed by the line of black pines. Travis stood unmoving until the last echo of hoofbeats died. Then slowly he lowered himself onto the porch steps. The wood groaned under his weight. His breath hung pale in the cold air. The cabin that only yesterday had glowed with promise now seemed colder than a grave. "Maybe they're right," he muttered to the empty clearing. "Maybe I've lost my mind." Spirit stepped close, pressed his warm muzzle against Travis's shoulder. The man leaned into him, eyes closing, and let out a long, shuddering sigh. It wasn't resolve that filled him then. It was loneliness. Loneliness sharp enough to hollow the chest. For the bitter truth settled on him like snow. Even his own blood no longer believed. The sun had begun its slow descent, bleeding a dull gold through the tops of the pines. Shadows stretched long across the clearing, painting the earth in strips of light and dark. Travis sat motionless on the porch step, the visit from his children weighing on him like stones. Spirit grazed nearby, tearing at patches of winter-dry grass with methodical patience. Travis watched the horse, envying the simple clarity of his existence. Eat, move, rest. No ghost rode Spirit's shoulders. No memories woke him in the dark heart hammering against his ribs. The Mustang lived entirely in the present, unburdened by the past or future. "Must be peaceful in that head of yours," Travis murmured. Spirit's ears flicked toward the sound, but he continued grazing, unconcerned with human troubles. Travis looked down at his hands. Scarred, calloused dirt worked so deep into the creases it would never truly wash clean. These hands had built things once. Before the war, before everything fell apart, he'd worked construction, raising frames, and setting roofs with quiet pride in a job well done. His eyes drifted to the cabin. Even in its broken state, it had bones. Good bones set by men who knew their craft. His grandfather had been one of them, apparently. Joseph Blackwood, whose tools now lay on the porch beside him, wrapped once more in their oilcloth. Travis reached for the bundle, untied it again with care. The chisel's edge still held a glimmer of sharpness. The knife handle was worn smooth where countless palms had gripped it. These tools had built things to last, things that stood long after their makers were gone. Something stirred in Travis's chest, faint but persistent, like an ember refusing to die. He stood tools in hand and walked to the half-dismantled roof. Anger and hurt still churned inside him, but beneath them ran something steadier. The need to work, to shape, to fix. To silence the chaos in his mind with the rhythm of hammer and saw. He climbed back onto the roof. The day was fading, but enough light remained. He positioned a rotten beam for removal, set the chisel against it, and struck with his hammer. The impact traveled up his arm, solid and real. He struck again and again. Each blow drove the chisel deeper. Each repetition focused his scattered thoughts. By the time darkness fell, he had removed 3 rotted beams and prepared the joints for new ones. His muscles burned his lungs, pulled hard at the cold mountain air. But his mind had quieted. The voices, his children's accusations, the memory of screams from distant battlefields, had receded, replaced by the simple calculations of carpentry. He stood in the clearing, looking up at the stars emerging in the deepening blue. The first edges of frost glimmered on the ground. Spirit had moved closer to the cabin, standing beneath what remained of the eaves. The horse's breath fogged in the chill, his dark eyes reflecting pinpricks of starlight. A sound from the forest edge caught their attention, a branch breaking under weight. Both man and horse turned toward it, alert for danger. From between the dark trunks emerged a massive bull elk, its antlers spreading wide against the twilight sky. It stepped into the clearing, steam rising from its nostrils, and stopped, aware of their presence. For a long moment, the elk stood motionless, studying them. Travis didn't move. He barely breathed. The great beast lowered its head slightly, nostrils flaring as it caught their scent. Its eyes, liquid and watchful, met Travis's across the distance. Something passed between them in that gaze, some wordless understanding. Here were 2 creatures facing the coming winter survivors in a land that forgave no weakness. The elk's muscles, tensed beneath its hide power, held in perfect control. It stamped once decisive, then turned and melted back into the forest, antlers disappearing last among the shadows. Travis released his breath. Spirit nickered softly beside him. The encounter had lasted only seconds, but it left Travis feeling strangely awakened, as if the elk had passed some vital energy to him through that shared gaze. He looked again at the cabin, seeing it with new clarity. The broken roof, the leaning wall, the rotted porch, they weren't evidence of defeat. They were challenges, problems with solutions, and solving problems was something his hands still remembered how to do. Travis walked to the porch and picked up his grandfather's Bible, its leather binding rough against his fingers. He opened it to the inside cover, reading again. Those weathered words, "A house will only stand if it is built with faith in honest hands." He pulled a stub of pencil from his pocket, turned to the back cover, and pressed it against the blank page there. His handwriting was rough, crooked, but legible. First day of building. It isn't much, but it's hope. He set the pencil down, closed the book, and returned to the tools waiting on the porch. Night had fallen completely now. The wind had picked up, carrying the first hint of snow. Tomorrow would bring cold, perhaps storm, but tomorrow would also bring work. Purposeful, necessary work. "We're not just surviving anymore, old friend," he said to Spirit, who had moved to stand beside him. "We're building something worth coming back to. Let's see what we're made of." Travis stretched his aching shoulders and carried his grandfather's tools inside. He built up the fire until flames leaped high, driving back the darkness, warming the small circle of space he had claimed as his own. Spirit followed, settling beside the hearth with the familiar creak of tired joints. Outside, the wind rose, scouring the mountainside with icy fingers. It howled through the gap in the roof, a hungry voice demanding entrance. Travis listened to its cry, no longer afraid of what it might stir in his memory. Let it come, let the winter do its worst. He had survived deserts and mountains, gunfire and loss. He had endured the disappointment in his children's eyes. He had withstood the gentle death of love. What was a Wyoming winter compared to all that? Travis laid another log on the fire and settled beside Spirit. The Mustang's warmth pressed against him, solid and real. Together they watched the flames dance, casting long shadows against the walls of what would become, must become, not just shelter, but home. The snow began just before dawn, small flakes at first hesitant and sparse, then thicker, driven by wind that gathered strength with the rising sun. Travis woke to a world transforming under white. He stood in the doorway, breath clouding, and calculated what needed doing before the storm hit in full. The roof was his first priority. Without it, nothing else mattered. He couldn't replace it entirely, not yet, not alone, but he could make it weather-tight enough to keep out the worst. He worked quickly, methodically, using what materials he had. Fallen pine branches became temporary supports. Canvas from his pack, stretched and secured, covered the largest gaps. He sealed smaller holes with a mixture of pine resin and mud, an old ranger trick, imperfect but effective. Spirit watched from below, occasionally disappearing into the trees, returning with branches or gripped in his teeth, an unexpected helper. Travis smiled faintly at the horse's initiative. "Smart old boy, aren't you?" he called down. Spirit dropped a pine bough at the cabin's base and snorted as if in agreement. By midday, the snow fell steadily, accumulating on the ground, weighing down the pine branches. The wind gusted unpredictably, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce enough to make Travis grab for support as he worked along the roof edge. He was securing the last corner of canvas when a particularly violent gust hit. The world tilted suddenly. A rotted beam weakened beyond what he'd realized, gave way beneath his weight. Travis felt the sickening lurch of support vanishing. He grabbed for the nearest solid timber fingers, scraping wood, finding no purchase. For a terrifying instant, he was falling. Then his hand caught something, the edge of a support beam he'd installed that morning. His body slammed against the side of the cabin, knocking the breath from his lungs. He hung there, one-handed legs dangling the ground a dizzying distance below. The beam creaked, threatening to pull free of its moorings. Travis tried to swing his other arm up, muscles straining, but his position was too awkward, the angle wrong. From below came a shrill whinny. Spirit circled frantically, head-tossing eyes fixed on his suspended master. The horse's alarm cut through Travis's panic, forced him to focus. He took a breath, steadied himself, and with one desperate heave managed to get his other hand on the beam. Inch by inch, he pulled himself up until he could hook a leg over the roof edge. He rolled onto the rough surface, heart hammering against his ribs, and lay still for several seconds, just breathing. Snow settled on his face, melting against the heat of his skin. "That was too damn close," he muttered to the sky. The near fall had shaken him, but it also clarified his priorities. Some parts of the cabin couldn't be saved. They would need to be torn down completely and rebuilt. But first he needed to secure what was still sound, create a core of stability around which reconstruction could happen. Travis climbed carefully down, avoiding the weakened section that had nearly claimed him. Spirit met him at the bottom, pressing his muzzle against Travis's chest, nostrils flaring as if checking for injury. "I'm all right, boy," Travis reassured him, patting the strong neck. "Thanks to you keeping watch." The storm intensified as afternoon wore into evening. Wind drove the snow horizontally, finding every gap in the cabin's walls. Travis worked by firelight, stuffing cracks with strips of cloth, positioning his bedroll in the most sheltered corner. The temperature dropped precipitously with nightfall. Even with the fire burning, hot cold seeped through the floor, through the walls, wrapping around Travis like a second skin. Spirit stood near the hearthsides, heaving gently, his body radiating valuable heat. Travis found himself talking to the horse continuously, the sound of his own voice a comfort against the storm's fury. "We'll need to cut fresh timber tomorrow if the weather breaks," he explained, hammering a strip of wood over a particularly wide gap. "Pine's not ideal. Too much sap doesn't season well. But beggars can't be choosers." The Mustang's ears flickered toward the sound, his dark eyes reflecting firelight. Travis continued, his words filling the howling silence of the blizzard. "Grandfather would have used oak if he could get it. Said pine was for quick jobs, oak for lasting ones." He paused, remembering the old man's weathered hands shaping a chair rung. He built things to outlive him, and they did. The night deepened. Snow piled against the north wall until it reached the window's edge. The fire burned lower as Travis rationed his wood supply, unsure how long the storm would last. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned, huddled beside Spirit's warm bulk, and still the cold found him sinking into his bones. He dozed fitfully, waking often to feed the fire or to check for leaks in his makeshift roof. During one such waking in the darkest hour before dawn, the wind's howl shifted in timber, raising spectral voices in its cry. Travis stiffened, breath catching. For a terrible moment, he was back in the mountains of Afghanistan, pinned down in a ravine, while insurgents moved through the rocks above. The wind became whispered commands in Pashto. The creak of the cabin transformed to the sound of weapons being readied. His heart accelerated, sweat breaking out despite the cold. His hand moved instinctively to his side, seeking a rifle that wasn't there. Spirit stirred beside him, sensing the change. The horse pressed closer, his solid weight anchoring Travis to the present. Travis buried his fingers in the coarse mane, focused on the texture, the reality of Chodet. Just the wind, he whispered as much to himself as to the horse. Just the Wyoming wind. He began to recite what he knew, the facts to counter the hallucinations threatening at the edge of his consciousness. I'm Travis Blackwood. I'm in Wyoming, in my grandfather's cabin. The war's over. I made it home. The words became a litany repeated until his breathing slowed, until the voices in the wind became just sound again, meaningless and natural. Spirit remained pressed against him, steady as stone, until Travis's rigid muscles finally relaxed. What would I do without you, boy? Travis murmured into the darkness. The Mustang's only answer was the continued rhythm of his breathing, but it was enough. Dawn broke gray and muted the storm, diminished but not ended. Travis rose stiffly, every joint protesting the night spent on the hard floor in bitter cold. He built up the fire-melted snow for water and forced himself to eat a little of his dwindling supplies. Then he bundled up and stepped outside to assess the damage. The clearing was transformed smooth white, replacing the rough ground he'd known before. Snow had drifted against the cabin's south wall, nearly covering the lower windows. The porch sagged under the weight, its support beams visibly bowed. But the roof had held. His patchwork repairs had kept out the worst of the snow. Travis nodded to himself, a small victory acknowledged. They had survived the first real test, but winter was just beginning and there would be many more storms before spring. He turned at the sound of hooves crunching through snow. Spirit had followed him out, steam rising from the Mustang's back as snow melted against his body heat. The horse surveyed the transformed landscape, ears forward, nostrils wide. Travis laid a hand on Spirit's shoulder, feeling the strong muscles beneath the hide. We've got work to do, partner, he said quietly, but we made it through the night. That's something. Spirit tossed his head as if in agreement, then lowered his muzzle to push aside snow, searching for any grass that might remain beneath. Travis watched him for a moment, then turned back to the cabin, to the day's tasks, to the problems that needed solving, to the quiet rhythm of work that would inch by inch rebuild not just this house, but perhaps the man himself. The storm had passed, but the real challenge was just beginning. Winter had shown its teeth, a warning of what was to come. Travis straightened his shoulders and stepped back toward the cabin. Let it come. They would be ready. 4 days after the storm, Travis took his first steps into the surrounding forest with purpose beyond mere survival. The axe swung in a clean arc, biting deep into the trunk of a young pine. Chips flew sharp as bone fragments. He'd chosen his trees carefully, straight, healthy specimens with few knots far enough from the cabin that their falling wouldn't threaten his shelter, but close enough to drag back without exhausting himself. Spirit stood nearby, watching with ears pricked forward. The horse had developed an uncanny sense for which trees Travis had marked for harvesting, often positioning himself on the opposite side as though helping to direct the fall. Stand back now, Travis warned as the pine began to creak. One final stroke and the tree surrendered to gravity, that crashing through lower branches before meeting the snow-covered ground with a muffled thud that sent birds scattering from neighboring pines. Travis wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. His muscles had begun to remember their old strength, responding to the demands of labor with growing endurance. He stripped the branches with methodical efficiency, then looked to Spirit. Ready for some real work. He'd fashioned a crude harness from rope and leather scraps salvaged from the cabin, distributing the weight across the Mustang's broad chest, rather than concentrating it at a single point. Spirit submitted to the arrangement with surprising patience, standing steady while Travis secured the lines around the fallen pine. The first attempt at movement nearly ended in failure. The tree caught against hidden obstacles beneath the snow, refusing to budge despite Spirit's straining muscles. Travis positioned himself alongside, shoulder pressed to the rough bark. Together now, he urged, pushing while Spirit pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the log shifted, broke free from whatever had trapped it, and began sliding reluctantly across the snow. The effort left them both panting, clouds of steam rising in the cold air, but there was satisfaction in the victory. Man and horse working as one, accomplishing what neither could manage alone. By midday, 3 pines lay in the clearing before the cabin, each stripped and ready for processing. Travis's hands bled from a dozen small cuts. His shoulder muscles burned with fatigue, but the physical discomfort carried its own reward. This was honest pain earned through creation rather than destruction. With a splitting maul and wooden wedges carved from hardwood scraps, he began quartering the largest trunk. Each strike drove the wedge deeper, forcing the wood grain to separate along its natural lines. The rhythm became meditative. Position strike, adjust strike again. His mind quieted, focused entirely on the task at hand. No room for Afghanistan, for his children's disappointment, for Jennifer's wedding invitation. Only wood metal and the space between them. The afternoon light was fading when Travis finally straightened, surveying his progress. Nearly half the first trunk had been split into usable sections, ready to be shaped into beams, joists, and planks. Not enough to rebuild the cabin entirely, but a promising start. "We'll make something of this yet," he told Spirit, who had returned from grazing to inspect the results of their labor. Inside the cabin, Travis tended the fire until it blazed hot, then set water to boil in a dented pot recovered from beneath the floorboards. While it heated, he examined his grandfather's tools again, testing edges, wiping away accumulated grime. The blade of the draw knife still held a decent edge, good enough for peeling bark from logs and rough shaping beams. He worked until his eyes grew heavy, hands moving by firelight, the pile of shavings growing at his feet. The familiar motions carried echoes of childhood summers spent in his grandfather's workshop, watching those same tools transform raw lumber into furniture, into homes, into legacies that outlasted their creator. Sleep claimed him mid-task, the knife still gripped in calloused fingers as his back against the cabin wall, Spirit standing guard nearby. For once, no nightmares disturbed his rest, only the dreamless sleep of physical exhaustion. Morning arrived with stinging clarity, the temperature having plummeted overnight. Frost patterns decorated the inside of the windows, delicate crystal geometries that caught the first rays of sunlight. Travis's breath hung visible in the cold air as he rekindled the fire from overnight embers. Outside, the world had transformed again. Every surface glittered with ice crystals, the snow crust frozen hard enough to bear weight. Travis tested it cautiously, finding he could walk atop the snow rather than plunging through. A small blessing that would make moving timber significantly easier. He worked through the morning fashioning a crude sled from salvaged boards. Nothing fancy, just runners connected by cross pieces, but it would allow him to transport materials more efficiently than dragging raw logs. Spirit watched the process with apparent interest, head tilted as Travis hammered the pieces together. The Mustang's ears suddenly swiveled toward the trail, body tensing in alertness. Travis straightened hand, instinctively reaching for his knife. Moments later, he heard it too. The steady rhythm of an approaching horse moving unhurriedly through the frozen forest. Sheriff Haynes appeared at the edge of the clearing, his breath and his mounts creating twin clouds of vapor in the frigid air. He sat tall in the saddle, shoulders squared beneath his heavy coat, taking in the changes to the cabin and yard with methodical attention. Travis nodded in greeting, brushing wood shavings from his hands. "Sheriff, Blackwood." The lawman dismounted with the careful movements of a man well past his prime but still firmly in command of his body. "Thought I'd check if you froze to death in that blizzard." His gaze swept over the stacked timber, the half-completed sled, the newly patched roof. "Seems reports of your demise would have been premature." Travis felt oddly exposed under that assessing gaze, as though the sheriff were cataloging not just the physical changes to the property, but something deeper in Travis himself. "Takes more than a little snow to finish me." "So I see." Haynes ran a gloved hand along one of the freshly cut logs, testing the quality with the knowledge of someone who'd built things himself. Most folks would have headed back to town after getting a taste of what these mountains can dish out. He knocked ice from his boots against the porch step. "Mind if I warm up before heading back?" Getting old makes the cold bite deeper. Travis gestured toward the door. Inside, the sheriff moved directly to the hearth, holding his hands toward the flames. His eyes traveled the interior of the cabin, noting the repaired sections of wall, the reorganized space, the tools laid out with care rather than scattered haphazardly. "You've been busy." Haynes removed his gloves, revealing hands mapped with old scars and the enlarged knuckles of arthritis. "This place was a death trap when I came through last week. Now it's almost habitable." Travis fed another log into the fire. Still got a long way to go. Always the way with rebuilding, never quite done. The sheriff's attention settled on Joseph Blackwood's tools arranged near the hearth. Those look like they've seen some years. Family pieces. My grandfather's. Found them hidden under the floorboards. Travis picked up the chisel, its handle smooth from decades of use. Turns out he helped build this place back in the 880s. Haynes nodded slowly as if pieces of a puzzle were connecting. Joseph Blackwood. I've heard that name. Old-timers in Dry Creek still talk about the craftsman who could make wood sing, as they put it. His weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. Didn't realize you were carrying that lineage. The recognition of his grandfather's name struck Travis unexpectedly. The idea that Joseph's reputation had outlived him by so many decades, that strangers still spoke of his skill with reverence. It formed a connection to this place Travis hadn't fully appreciated until now. Neither did I, if I'm honest. Travis examined the blade of the knife, the carved initials worn but distinct. Guess some things skip a generation or two. Haynes warmed himself for several minutes more, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained. When he finally moved toward the door, he paused, reaching into his coat. Almost forgot. Brought something you might find useful. He placed a small burlap sack on the table. Metal clinked faintly against metal. Travis opened it cautiously. Inside lay an assortment of iron nails, a whetstone of good quality, a coil of wire, and a glass bottle filled with amber liquid. He looked up questioningly. Wood oil, Haynes explained, nodding toward the bottle. For weatherproofing. That roof won't hold through February without it. He rebuttoned his coat, adjusted his hat. The nails were sitting in my shed gathering rust. Might as well put them to use. The unexpected generosity left Travis momentarily speechless. I appreciate it. Just being practical. County's short on resources as it is. Don't need to be sending a rescue party up here if your roof collapses. The sheriff moved toward the door, then turned back, eyes narrowing as he studied Travis with sudden intensity. You know, when you first rode into Dry Creek, I pegged you for a certain kind of man. The kind that passes through, takes what they need and moves on. War does that to some. Makes them restless, rootless. Travis felt himself stiffen, preparing for judgment. But I'm starting to think I read you wrong. Haynes gestured toward the cabin, the work in progress surrounding them. This isn't the action of someone just passing through. This is the work of a builder. He stepped onto the porch, hand resting briefly on the doorframe. And we could use more builders around here, Blackwood. Remember that. The sheriff mounted his horse with practiced efficiency, settling into the saddle like a man who'd spent most of his life viewing the world from that vantage point. He gathered the reins, then delivered a parting observation that would echo in Travis's mind for days to come. I used to think a man like you was good only for riding and shooting. A soldier, a gun hand, someone who breaks things. Now I see you're something else entirely. You're a craftsman. You're building more than walls here. With that, he wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving Travis standing in the doorway, the sheriff's words settling around him like a mantle he wasn't sure he deserved, but desperately wanted to earn. The days that followed established a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Each morning began before dawn, Travis rising in darkness to coax the night's embers back to life. While the cabin warmed, he studied his grandfather's Bible fingers, tracing the faded handwriting, absorbing the brief notes and observations recorded in margins. Not just scripture interpretations, but practical wisdom about building, about wood properties, about patience. With first light, he'd begin the day's labor. The work divided naturally into categories: harvesting timber, processing logs, repairing existing structures, and fashioning new elements to replace what couldn't be saved. Each task required different skills, different tools, different approaches to problem solving. The variety kept both body and mind engaged, prevented the dangerous spiral into repetitive thought that so often triggered his worst memories. Spirit proved an unexpectedly adept partner. The Mustangs seemed to anticipate needs before Travis voiced them, positioning himself to brace a beam being raised, dragging the improvised sled without complaint, even using his substantial weight to help compress snow into a packed trail between the timber stand and the cabin clearing. Their communication evolved beyond words into something more primal, a shared purpose expressed through movement and presence. 2 weeks after the sheriff's visit, Travis faced his first major structural challenge. The cabin's north wall had begun to bow inward, threatening collapse, under the accumulated weight of snow pressing against it. Temporary bracing bought time, but the underlying issue required more permanent intervention. Working from his grandfather's notes and his own construction experience, Travis devised diagonal bracing that would distribute the force across a wider area. Installing it meant removing part of the interior wall surface, a delicate operation in freezing temperatures. As he pried away the innermost layer of planking, he discovered another hidden compartment tucked between support beams. Unlike the floor cache that had yielded the Bible and tools, this space appeared deliberately finished, its edges sanded smooth, its proportions carefully considered. Inside lay a small wooden box, its lid decorated with an inlaid pattern of mountain ranges crafted from different wood types. Travis removed it carefully, brushing away decades of dust. The hinges protested faintly as he opened it, revealing contents that stopped his breath. A daguerreotype photograph in a small metal frame, showing a young couple standing before the cabin, their expressions solemn as was customary for early photography. The woman held an infant wrapped in a blanket. Behind them, the cabin stood new and proud, its logs golden with fresh-cut pine, its roof straight and true. Tucked alongside the photograph was a folded piece of paper, the creases so fragile Travis feared it might disintegrate at his touch. He opened it with utmost care, revealing handwriting he recognized from the Bible, his grandfather's careful script, though executed with a younger, steadier hand. Completed our home today, October 12, 1887. Catherine says it's sturdy enough to withstand anything these mountains might throw at us, and I pray she's right. Young Joseph Jr. deserves a place that will stand for generations. Built the west wall thicker than needed, winters here demand respect. Used oak for the main support beams. Had to haul it 20 miles but worth every mile for the strength it provides. A man's legacy isn't measured in what he takes from this world, but in what he creates that remains after he's gone. Travis sat motionless, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. Joseph Jr., his father whom he'd barely known, who died when Travis was just 5 years old. The infant in the photograph. And Catherine, the grandmother, whose face had faded from his memory over the decades. Here was his lineage, his blood connected directly to this place through timber and nails and purpose. With renewed determination, Travis returned to the wall bracing now, understanding that his work served not just his immediate needs, but honored a family legacy. The cabin wasn't merely shelter, it was heritage made manifest, a testament to endurance across generations. The wall stabilized, Travis turned his attention to the most critical vulnerability remaining, the roof. The patchwork repairs had held through several snowfalls, but each new accumulation stressed the structure further. A proper roof would require significant timber properly milled and fitted. Working alone made the task exponentially more difficult. He devised a system of pulleys using salvaged rope and carved wooden blocks, allowing him to raise beams into position without endangering himself. The first attempt failed spectacularly, the rope snapping under tension, sending a support beam crashing to the ground inches from where Spirit stood. The Mustang didn't bolt, a testament to the trust they'd built. But his wide-eyed alarm mirrored Travis's own realization of how easily the project could turn deadly. "Sorry about that, partner," Travis muttered, inspecting the frayed rope end. "Need to be smarter about this." He reinforced the lines, tested each connection under partial load and calculated angles with greater care. The second attempt succeeded, the beam rising smoothly into position, where Travis secured it with pegs driven into pre-drilled holes. By sunset, the first section of proper roofing was in place. A small victory, but significant. That night, a winter storm rolled through the mountains, testing his workmanship with driving snow and knife-edge winds. Travis lay awake, listening to the elements assault the cabin, mentally tracking each creak and groan. The new section held firm, but water began seeping through older portions, dripping steadily onto the floor. He positioned buckets and pans to catch the worst leaks, then sat wrapped in blankets beside the fire, Spirit pressed close against his side. The Mustang's body heat helped ward off the penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the very air. "We're in for a long night, boy." Travis fed another log into the flames. "But we've had worse, haven't we?" The horse's ears flicked in response, eyes reflecting firelight as he dozed. Travis envied the animal's ability to rest despite the chaos surrounding them. His own mind refused to quiet, calculating what adjustments would be needed come morning, what materials could be repurposed, How many days of favorable weather would be required to complete the next section? The storm intensified past midnight, wind screaming around the cabin corners like a living thing seeking entrance. A particularly violent gust tore loose part of the old roof, sending it crashing against the side of the cabin with a sound like artillery fire. Travis jolted upright, momentarily disoriented. The cabin walls dissolved into rocky outcroppings. The wind transformed to shouts in Pashto. The snow beating against windows became the distinctive rattling of AK-47 fire. His body responded automatically, diving for cover, reaching for weapons that weren't there. Spirit's startled whinny cut through the hallucination. The horse had risen to his feet, alarmed not by imaginary insurgents, but by Travis's sudden movement. The Mustang's solid presence anchored Travis to reality. This was Wyoming, not Afghanistan. The danger was weather, not enemies. Just the storm, Travis whispered, forcing his breathing to slow. Just the damn storm. Come morning, the damage was evident, but not catastrophic. A 3-foot section of the old roof had torn free, allowing snow to pile inside one corner of the cabin. The new section Travis had installed remained intact, vindication of his methods and materials. He cleared the snow, patched the gap with canvas temporarily, and assessed what would be needed for permanent repair. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crystalline sky of impossible blue and temperatures that made every breath painful. Too cold for proper construction work. The wood would be brittle, the metal tools dangerous to handle with bare skin. Instead, Travis focused on interior improvements. Using salvaged planks from what had once been built-in shelving, he constructed a proper bed frame, raised off the floor, providing insulation against the ground chill that had seeped through his bedroll nightly. He fashioned a small table and stool, their surfaces rough but functional. From pine boughs, he created a mattress of sorts, layering them to form a surprisingly comfortable and fragrant sleeping surface. These small comforts represented more than mere convenience. They were declarations of permanence, of commitment to this place. A man intending to move on didn't build furniture. A man merely surviving didn't concern himself with craftsmanship. The table's edges were beveled not because functionality demanded it, but because aesthetics mattered. The bed frame's corners were joined with proper mortise and tenon connections rather than expedient nails because integrity mattered. The stool was carved with a subtle pattern of mountains along its edge because beauty mattered. 3 weeks into his reconstruction efforts, Travis woke to the peculiar silence that follows heavy snowfall. Opening the door revealed nearly 2 feet of fresh powder, its surface unmarked by tracks or disturbance. The world appeared renewed, the broken and jagged, transformed into smooth contours of white. Even the half-dismantled sections of the cabin seemed less wounded under their blanket of snow. He spent that morning clearing paths to the woodpile, an improvised stable area where Spirit sheltered. The physical labor generated welcome heat, combating the bone-deep cold that had settled into the valley. By midday, the sun emerged, transforming the landscape into a blinding expanse of brilliance that required squinted eyes and shaded vision. The sound of approaching hoofbeats came unexpectedly, muffled by snow, but growing steadily louder. Travis paused in his work hand, moving instinctively to the knife at his belt, a habit from wartime that civilian life hadn't yet erased. Spirit nickered softly, more curious than alarmed. A lone rider appeared at the forest edge, silhouetted against the dark pines. Even at distance, Travis recognized the set of those shoulders, the rigid posture. Michael, his son, had come alone without Sarah, his approach deliberate and unhurried. Travis set aside his shovel, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the cold. The boy, no young man now, guided his horse through the deep snow with competent hands, eyes taking in the changes to the cabin and clearing. His expression remained carefully neutral, neither hostile nor welcoming a mask Travis recognized as self-protection. Michael reined in several yards away, studying the improvements with evident surprise. The leaning wall had been straightened, portions of the roof replaced, the porch reinforced. Stacked timber and milled planks testified to ongoing work. His gaze finally settled on Travis himself, noting the changes that weeks of labor had wrought. The increased muscle definition, the purposeful posture, the clear-eyed focus that had replaced vacant staring. "Mom said I should check if you were still alive." Michael's voice carried the forced casualness of someone trying to maintain emotional distance. "The storm hit town pretty hard. Figured it would be worse up here." "What I done?" Travis nodded, respecting the pretense that this was merely a welfare check rather than the tentative olive branch it represented. It was a rough one, but we managed. Michael dismounted his movements, betraying the stiffness of someone who'd ridden a considerable distance in bitter cold. He approached the cabin cautiously, as though expecting to find the interior unchanged from his last visit. Broken chaotic, a reflection of its occupants' fractured state. Instead, he found order. The floor had been swept clean, the walls patched where possible, the meager furnishings arranged with purpose rather than haphazardly. A hook near the door held Travis's coat and hat, a shelf beside the hearth organized tools by type and frequency of use, and the table bore evidence of recent woodworking, shavings, and a partially carved piece that resembled a chess piece. Michael's fingers traced the edge of the table, testing the smoothness of the finish. "You made this." Wasn't much to do during the coldest days except work inside. Travis added a log to the fire, giving his son space to process the changes without scrutiny. "Kept my hands busy." Michael continued his inspection, pausing at the small box containing the family daguerreotype and letter now displayed prominently on a wall shelf. He examined the photograph without touching it, recognition dawning. "Is that your great-grandfather Joseph and your great-grandmother Catherine?" Travis moved beside him, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "They built this place in 1887. That baby they're holding is my father." Michael studied the image with newfound interest, the connection to his own lineage clearly striking him differently than it might have during his angry visit weeks earlier. "I didn't know any of this existed." "Neither did I until recently." Travis gestured to the Bible and tools, found them hidden under the floorboards. "Turns out this cabin wasn't just some random shelter. It's part of our family history." Something shifted in Michael's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight release of the tension that had held his features rigid. He glanced around the cabin again, now seeing it not as evidence of his father's deterioration, but as a tangible connection to their shared ancestry. "That's why you're fixing it?" Not a question, but a realization. Travis nodded. "One reason. There are others." Michael didn't press for elaboration, instead moving to examine the wall bracing Travis had installed, testing its solidity with a critical eye that reminded Travis powerfully of Jennifer. The same analytical assessment, the same attention to detail. "This is good work," Michael admitted grudgingly. "Wouldn't have expected it." The backhanded compliment might have stung once, but Travis recognized it as progress, acknowledgement rather than dismissal. "Still learning as I go. Your great-grandfather left some notes that have helped." Michael continued his inspection, his initial discomfort gradually giving way to genuine curiosity. He asked practical questions about the roof design, the wall reinforcement, the sourcing of materials. Travis answered without embellishment, explaining his methods and the reasoning behind them. It wasn't the emotional reconciliation Travis might have hoped for, but it was communication. Rational, respectful, real. When Michael finally prepared to leave, the shadows had lengthened across the snow, warning of the approaching dusk. He mounted his horse with the ease of someone raised in ranch country, settling into the saddle with unconscious grace. "Sarah wanted to come," he offered unexpectedly. "She had finals this week, end of semester." Travis absorbed this information, both the fact that his daughter had wanted to visit and the reminder of how much of their lives continued without his participation. "Tell her I understand. School comes first." Michael gathered the reins, hesitating before delivering his parting question. "Do you need help with any of this?" The query hung between them, fragile as frost crystals. Travis recognized it for what it was. Not just an offer of physical assistance, but a tentative bridge across the chasm that had developed between them. He chose his response carefully, neither presuming too much nor dismissing the significance of what was being extended. "Yes," he said simply. "There's one last thing I'm working on, and I think you'd want to see it." Michael nodded, the gesture containing neither commitment nor refusal, merely acknowledgement. He turned his horse toward the trail, then paused for a final observation. "You seem different, not fixed exactly, but more like yourself, or maybe more like someone I never knew you could be." Before Travis could respond, Michael nudged his mount forward, disappearing into the gathering twilight, leaving Travis standing in the clearing with those words echoing in his mind. Not a full reconciliation, but perhaps the first hesitant step toward understanding. That night, Travis sat at his handmade table, a sheet of paper before him and a stubby pencil in hand. Words had never come easily to him, actions always speaking more clearly than any letter could convey. But some bridges couldn't be built with hammer and nails alone. He started and discarded 3 drafts before settling on simplicity. Friday evening, I'll be cooking the first meal in the new house. If you can come, I'll be waiting. No explanations, no expectations, no pressure, just an invitation to share space, to break bread, to perhaps begin healing wounds that ran deeper than any physical injury he'd sustained in combat. He folded the paper, carefully sealed it in an envelope salvaged from the mail Sheriff Haynes had delivered, and addressed it to both children. The next morning brought clear skies and marginally warmer temperatures, good conditions for the next phase of roof work. Travis had just positioned the ladder against the cabin wall when he heard the distinctive rumble of the weekly supply wagon that traveled between Dry Creek and the more remote homesteads and mining claims. The driver, a weather-beaten man named Ellis, who'd transported goods through these mountains for decades, reined in his team at the edge of the clearing. His eyebrows rose noticeably as he took in the changes to the cabin and surrounding area. "Well, now, Blackwood, looks like you're planning to stay a while." Ellis's voice carried the gravelly texture of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors in all conditions. "Most folks who take shelter here move on once they get a taste of what February brings to these parts." Travis approached the wagon envelope in hand. "Got something that needs delivering to town, if you're willing." Ellis accepted the letter, examining the address with undisguised curiosity. "Your youngsters, aren't they the girl and boy who rode up here about a month back?" At Travis's nod, he tucked the envelope into his coat. "I'll see it gets to them direct. Heading back tomorrow morning." "Appreciate it." Travis hesitated, then added, "There's coffee on if you want to warm up before continuing on." The invitation surprised both of them. Travis not being known for sociability, Ellis accustomed to brief transactional interactions rather than hospitality. After a moment's consideration, the driver secured his team and followed Travis inside. Ellis circled the cabin interior slowly, professional interest evident in his assessment. "You've done more with this place in a month than the last 3 squatters managed in years combined." He accepted the offered mug, hands wrapping gratefully around its warmth. "Though I reckon you've got more motivation than most, it being family property and all." Travis looked up sharply. "How did you know that?" Ellis sipped his coffee, satisfaction evident as the heat spread through him. "Been running this route 40-odd years, son. I remember your grandfather bringing supplies up here in the summers, maintaining the place long after he had moved his main household to town. Joseph was particular about his lumber. Wouldn't accept anything with excessive knots or improper curing." He gestured toward the wall bracing. "See, you inherited his eye for structural integrity." The casual revelation that Ellis had known his grandfather personally stunned Travis into momentary silence. Here was yet another connection to this place, another thread binding him to a history he had only begun to discover. "What else do you remember about him?" Travis found himself asking, hungry suddenly for details about the man whose tools he now wielded. Ellis settled onto the stool, warming to his subject. "Joseph Blackwood wasn't one for wasted words or wasted motion. Built half the permanent structures in Dry Creek, the church, the mercantile, the original schoolhouse. Had a reputation for never needing to rebuild his work. Do it right the first time, he'd say, and you won't spend your life doing it over." The driver gestured toward the carefully joined table. "Looks like some of that wisdom found its way to you." They talked a while longer, Ellis sharing anecdotes about the area's history, the particularly severe winter of '52, the changes he'd witnessed over decades of traversing these mountain routes. When he finally departed, Travis felt strangely energized, despite the interruption to his work schedule. The stories had populated the cabin with ghosts of a different sort. Not the traumatic specters of war that had haunted him for years, but benevolent ancestors whose labor had created the legacy he now continued. The days that followed took on new significance. Each repair, each improvement, became not just a tactical response to immediate needs, but a contribution to something larger than himself. Travis worked with renewed purpose, conscious that his efforts connected him to generations past and potentially to generations future. He completed the roof during a 3-day stretch of favorable weather, the structure now properly sealed against snow and rain. The walls received additional insulation, layers of pine boughs sandwiched between interior and exterior planking, dramatically reducing heat loss. The floor was reinforced where rot had weakened support joists, eliminating the ominous creaking that had accompanied every step. Between construction tasks, Travis turned his attention to smaller projects that transformed the cabin from mere shelter to actual home. He fashioned proper shutters for the windows hinged to swing open during daylight hours and secure tightly against night winds. He built a storage chest for the limited supplies and personal items he possessed, its lid carved with the same mountain pattern that decorated the heirloom box. Most significantly, he created what he privately termed the memory wall, a section of interior wall planed smooth and dedicated to family artifacts. The daguerreotype held the central position, flanked by pages from his grandfather's journal, detailing the cabin's original construction. Below these hung a crude drawing Travis had found between wallboards, a child's rendering of the cabin with stick figures standing before it labeled in uncertain script, "Our House." Each addition to the wall served as physical reminder that this place had never been merely a structure of wood and stone. It had been home to generations of Blackwoods, had witnessed births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. In reclaiming the cabin, Travis wasn't just securing shelter for himself, he was honoring those who had come before and preserving something for those who might come after. The most challenging aspect of preparation for his children's potential visit was the meal itself. Travis's culinary skills were limited at best, developed primarily through necessity rather than interest or talent. His diet since arriving at the cabin had consisted largely of basic provisions: beans, coffee hardtack, supplemented with occasional fresh meat when hunting proved successful. A proper dinner required planning and resources beyond his current inventory. The solution presented itself in the form of a young buck that wandered into the clearing 3 days before the appointed evening. Travis's shot was clean, the deer dropping instantly without suffering. Field dressing the carcass reminded him of skills learned from his father during rare childhood hunting trips, memories that carried surprising warmth rather than the pain that typically accompanied thoughts of his parents. Spirit showed unexpected interest in the butchering process, standing nearby as Travis worked, occasionally nickering softly as though offering encouragement or approval. The horse's presence had become so constant that Travis often found himself narrating his activities aloud, explaining techniques or reasoning through problems, as if the Mustang were an apprentice rather than a silent observer. "Venison needs proper aging," Travis explained, hanging sections of meat in the coldest corner of the cabin. "Too fresh, and it's tough as boot leather. A few days mellowing makes all the difference." The morning of the dinner brought nerves Travis hadn't anticipated. He found himself double-checking everything: the stability of the table and chairs, the cleanliness of the crude plates and utensils. He'd fashioned the placement of lanterns for optimal light. He swept the floor 3 times, adjusted the position of furniture repeatedly, and fussed over the cooking fire with uncharacteristic anxiety. They might not come at all, he reminded himself, tempering expectations. The invitation had been sent, but no confirmation had returned. Michael's visit had suggested openness to reconciliation, but Sarah remained an unknown quantity, her hurt and anger potentially too deep for a simple dinner invitation to overcome. Still, he prepared as though their arrival were certain. The venison stew simmered slowly, enriched with wild onions and herbs he'd dried during autumn. Cornmeal from his dwindling supplies became a rough bread baked in the coals. He even managed to produce a sweetened berry preserve from the last of his sugar ration, mixed with dried berries collected during his first days at the cabin. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, Travis found himself increasingly restless. He chopped extra firewood, though the existing supply was ample. He groomed Spirit until the Mustang's coat gleamed like polished obsidian. He even attempted to trim his own beard, using the knife's reflection in a window pane, the results uneven but considerably less wild than his previous appearance. Most significantly, he placed oil lamps in each window, not just for practical illumination as darkness fell, but as beacons visible from the forest trail. If Sarah and Michael attempted the journey, they would find their way guided by these small, determined flames, each one representing hope that the fractured family might yet find common ground. The sky darkened to deep indigo stars emerging with cold brilliance against the gathering night. Travis stepped onto the porch, breath fogging in the bitter air. The temperature had dropped steadily since sundown, frost already forming on exposed surfaces. He scanned the tree line, searching for movement, listening for the telltale sound of approaching horses. Nothing disturbed the perfect stillness except the occasional crack of branches contracting in the cold. He waited until his fingers grew numb despite heavy gloves, then reluctantly returned inside. The stew continued its slow simmer, filling the cabin with rich aroma. The bread had cooled to perfect temperature. Everything waited in readiness for guests who showed no sign of arriving. Travis poured himself coffee more for something to occupy his hands than from actual thirst. Perhaps he had expected too much hope too quickly for healing that required more time, more evidence of change. Perhaps the invitation had never reached them, lost somewhere between Ellis's wagon and their hands. Or perhaps they had simply decided he wasn't worth the effort, the risk of another disappointment. He had just resigned himself to dining alone when Spirit's alert whinny broke the silence. The Mustang stood at the window, ears pricked forward, eyes fixed on something beyond Travis's vision. A moment later, Travis heard it too, the muffled rhythm of hooves moving through snow, not from the main trail, but from the less traveled northern approach. Hope surged, tempered immediately by caution. Late travelers in these mountains weren't always friendly. He moved to the door hand, resting near his knife, and peered into the darkness beyond the pool of lantern light that spilled from the windows. Two riders materialized from the shadows between pine trunks, their forms gradually taking shape as they entered the illuminated clearing. Relief washed through Travis as he recognized Sarah's distinctive posture, the determined set of her shoulders even bundled against the cold. Beside her rode Michael, his figure taller than Travis remembered, as though the weeks since their last meeting had added inches to his frame. They had come. Despite distance, despite history, despite the bitter night and uncertain welcome, his children had answered his invitation. Travis stepped off the porch into the snow, raising a hand in greeting, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he called out. As they drew closer, he could see their expressions. Caution mixed with curiosity, apprehension tempered by what might have been the faintest hope of their own. Sarah reined in first, her breath clouding around her face, her eyes taking in the transformed cabin with undisguised amazement. "Dad," her voice carried the disbelief of someone encountering the impossible. "Is this really the same place?" Travis nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the simple fact of their presence. He gestured toward the cabin, where golden light spilled from every window, where smoke rose straight and sure from the chimney, where order had replaced chaos and purpose had overcome despair. "Come inside," he managed, finding his voice at last. "There's warmth waiting. And dinner." Sarah and Michael exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then, with simultaneous movement that suggested prior agreement, they dismounted and led their horses toward the cabin that had once been merely a ruin but now stood transformed, much like the man who had rebuilt it piece by patient piece. Snow crunched beneath Sarah and Michael's boots as they crossed the remaining distance to the cabin. Travis held the door open, warmth and firelight spilling out into the winter night. They hesitated at the threshold, as though crossing it required a decision more significant than mere physical movement. Sarah entered first, her steps, tentative eyes widening as she absorbed the transformation of the interior. Gone was the broken ruin they had witnessed during their last visit. In its place stood a proper home, modest and rustic, but unmistakably cared for. The floor had been sanded, smooth gaps between planks sealed against drafts. Walls stood true and solid, patched where necessary, reinforced where vulnerable. The roof no longer threatened to collapse, instead providing secure shelter evident in the absence of snow piles that had previously formed beneath the worst leaks. Most striking was the order that had replaced chaos. Everything occupied its proper place, tools arranged by purpose on wall pegs, firewood stacked neatly beside the hearth, handcrafted furniture positioned for both function and comfort. Oil lamps cast a golden glow across surfaces that had been scraped clean of decades of grime and neglect. Michael followed his sister inside, his usual guardedness momentarily suspended as he turned in a slow circle, taking in details that spoke of hours of patient labor. His gaze lingered on the new table centered in the room, set with 3 crude but carefully fashioned wooden plates and cups. "You made all this?" Michael's voice carried reluctant admiration, his gloved hand brushing the table's edge, testing the smoothness of the finish. Travis nodded, suddenly uncertain what to do with his hands. He settled for gesturing toward a corner where they could hang their coats. "Thought we might eat while everything's hot. Been keeping the stew warm." The normalcy of the invitation seemed to break some of the tension. Sarah unwound her scarf, revealing cheeks flushed from cold and exertion. "It smells amazing in here," she admitted, removing her gloves finger by finger. "Like actual food, not just survival." Travis moved to the hearth where the venison stew simmered in a cast-iron pot he'd rescued from beneath years of neglect. He ladled generous portions into bowls carved from pine, the wood sealed with beeswax to prevent seepage. The cornbread came next, rough textured but golden brown, cut into thick slabs that steamed in the cool air. They seated themselves with cautious formality, like distant acquaintances rather than family. Travis couldn't help noticing how adult they suddenly appeared. Sarah's posture straight and contained Michael's hands larger than he remembered, his shoulders filling out his coat, in a way that seemed impossible given the boy he still pictured. The first minutes passed in awkward silence, broken only by the sounds of eating. Travis watched them surreptitiously, noting Sarah's surprised appreciation after her first taste of the stew, Michael's methodical approach to his meal, testing each component separately before combining them. "This is actually good," Michael finally offered, breaking the silence. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" Travis set down his spoon, considering his answer. "Necessity, mostly. That and watching your grandmother when I was about your age. She could make something from nothing, especially during lean winters." "Mom says you never talk about your parents." Sarah's observation carried the weight of accumulated family silence, years of questions left unasked and unanswered. "Wasn't much to tell, or maybe too much." Travis gestured toward the memory wall he'd created, drawing their attention to the daguerreotype. "That's my grandfather, Joseph, and grandmother, Catherine. The baby is my father." Sarah rose to examine the photograph more closely, wonder replacing guarded caution in her expression. "This is our family, right here in this cabin. 4 generations of Blackwoods have sheltered under this roof. You two make the 5th. Travis joined her at the wall, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "Found most of this hidden in the walls and floors while making repairs, like the place was preserving its own history, waiting for someone to uncover it." Michael approached from the other side, studying the primitive photograph with newfound interest. "So this isn't just some random cabin you decided to hide in? It's actually ours." "It is, though I didn't know that when I first arrived." Travis indicated the Bible and tools displayed on a nearby shelf. "These belong to Joseph. His craftsmanship built half the original structures in Dry Creek, according to the sheriff and others who remember the stories." Sarah touched the frame of the photograph with reverent fingers. "It's like finding missing pages from a book you didn't even know you were reading." The observation struck Travis with unexpected force. That was precisely how it felt, discovering connections to a lineage he had barely acknowledged, filling gaps in his own understanding of who he was and where he belonged. "There's something else I want to show you." Travis led them to another section of wall where he'd mounted 3 simple frames he'd crafted from pine. Inside, the first preserved under a pane of salvaged glass, rested a small photograph, 2 children sitting on the cabin's porch steps during a long-ago summer, their faces bright with laughter. Sarah leaned closer, recognition dawning. "That's us. I remember that day we came up to help Grandma pick berries." Her voice softened with the memory. "You carried me on your shoulders when my legs got tired." When born in the second frame, protected between layers of oiled paper, was a lock of pale gold hair tied with faded ribbon. "Your first haircut," Travis explained, watching Sarah's expression shift between surprise and something deeper. "Your mother saved it, said it was important to mark the milestones." The third frame held a child's drawing, the paper yellowed at the edges, the crayon marks still vibrant despite the years. In awkward block letters across the bottom, "To Daddy, my hero." Michael stood motionless before this last item, his posture rigid. "I drew that before you deployed the second time." His voice had lost its defensive edge, replaced by quiet wonder. "You kept it all this time." "I did." Travis didn't elaborate on how the drawing had traveled with him through dust-choked mountain passes and blood-soaked valleys half a world away, how it had remained folded in his pocket, through firefights and evacuations, a talisman of everything he fought to return to. Sarah turned, suddenly eyes bright with unshed tears. "Oh, Dad," her voice breaking on the word. "We were wrong. I was wrong. All these years looking at the wrong thing." Travis didn't move, didn't attempt to close the distance between them. Some bridges couldn't be crossed in a single step. Some wounds needed air before they could properly heal. But the atmosphere in the cabin had altered fundamentally, the defensive barriers lowering like a slow exhalation after held breath. "Come eat before everything gets cold," he suggested, giving them space to process what they'd seen. There's plenty more. They returned to the table, but the careful formality had dissolved. Sarah passed the cornbread without being asked. Michael refilled his father's cup when he noticed it empty. Small gestures, insignificant in isolation, monumental in context. Conversation resumed tentative at first, then gaining confidence. Sarah described her senior year challenges, college applications, scholarship essays, the pressure of decisions that seemed to carry the weight of her entire future. Mom wants me to apply to her alma mater, but I'm thinking about forestry programs instead. She glanced up, gauging Travis's reaction. Everyone acts like it's crazy to consider a career that keeps me in Wyoming instead of escaping to somewhere more sophisticated. Travis considered her words carefully, recognizing the request for validation beneath the statement. These mountains get in your blood. Nothing wrong with wanting to stay connected to a place that feels like home. Sarah's smile, the first genuine one of the evening, transformed her face back into the child he remembered. That's what I keep trying to explain. I don't want to manage spreadsheets in some office. I want to be outside working with my hands doing something real. Michael snorted softly. Says the girl who complained every time Mom asked her to weed the garden. That's different, Sarah protested, the familiar sibling dynamic emerging naturally. That was chores. This would be my choice. Their bickering carried no real heat, just the comfortable rhythm of long-established patterns. Travis watched them, savoring the normalcy of the moment, his children at his table sharing food he had prepared, gradually relaxing into versions of themselves he hadn't seen in years. Michael eventually steered the conversation toward his own recent experiences, a failed hunting trip that had become family legend, apparently for its spectacular incompetence. The wind shifted at exactly the wrong moment. Buck spooked. I loosed my arrow. He groaned at the memory. Missed by a mile. Arrow ricocheted off a rock and nearly took out Sheriff Haynes's hat where it hung on a peg outside his office. Sarah dissolved into laughter. His face, he didn't say a single word, just looked at Michael like he was adding it to some invisible list of Blackwood family crimes. Travis found himself chuckling, the sound rusty but genuine. Haynes is a fair man. He'll have forgotten it by now. Not according to Mom. She says he still brings it up whenever she crosses paths with him in town. Michael pushed his empty plate away, relaxing back in his chair. Though lately he's been asking about you. How you're doing up here, if you need anything. The statement carried no accusation, just simple reporting of fact. Still, Travis felt a twinge of regret for the worry he must have caused, the uncertainty his isolation had created for those who, despite everything, still considered him family. Been meaning to get back to town, he admitted. Just needed to make this place secure first. Winter up here doesn't allow much margin for error. The meal complete, they moved closer to the fire. The strained atmosphere that had marked their arrival had transformed into something approaching comfortable familiarity. Not perfect, not without shadows of past hurt, but navigable, a path appearing where before there had seemed only impassable terrain. Travis added wood to the flames, creating a momentary shower of sparks that illuminated the walls in flickering gold. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, the night air crystallizing into the bone-deep cold that defined Wyoming winters. Inside, the cabin held warmth like a cupped hand sheltering a flame. When the thaw comes, Travis found himself saying, I thought to cut a path down to the creek. It's not far. If we lay brush in spring and tamp it, the ground might hold even after rain. The word we had slipped out unplanned, a hope rather than presumption. Neither Sarah nor Michael challenged it. Instead, Michael leaned forward, elbows on knees. What else are you planning? The question contained no skepticism, only curiosity. Travis recognized it as the olive branch. It was interest in a future that might include all of them in some capacity. Thinking about a vegetable garden come spring, the south-facing slope gets good sun. Might be we could put in a small chicken coop along the east wall, once temperatures moderate. A few hens wouldn't mind the cold after the cabin traps enough heat. Sarah brightened visibly. I could bring seeds when the ground thaws. The nursery in town always has extras they're willing to share if you help with early planting. If you need a sign for the path, she continued, a tentative smile playing at the corners of her mouth, I could carve one. I can get the letters straighter now than I could when I wrote that ridiculous note. She glanced at the memory wall, then back at Travis, and her smile told him the word ridiculous was spoken with love. Michael stretched his legs toward the fire, flexing fingers that still showed the softness of youth rather than the hardened calluses that marked Travis's hands. I'm no good with planes and chisels, he admitted, but I can shoot straighter than I did in October if someone teaches me right. Maybe, maybe you could tune my aim. Next season. I will, Travis promised, and for once the commitment felt solid grounded in possibility rather than wishful thinking. We'll start with breath. You can't hit what you can't breathe steady enough to see. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing more naturally as the evening deepened into night. When Sarah stifled a yawn, Travis realized how late it had grown. The journey back to town would be arduous in darkness and bitter cold. You're welcome to stay, he offered, gesturing toward the recently constructed sleeping platform. It's not much, but it's warm. I can make up pallets near the fire. Brother and sister exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. Mom's expecting us back, Sarah explained, regret evident in her tone. We promised we wouldn't stay too late. Travis nodded, hiding his disappointment. One meal couldn't erase years of absence and hurt. Trust required time to rebuild, consistency to maintain. Another time, perhaps. They gathered their coats and gloves, preparing for the cold journey ahead. Travis filled a small sack with leftover cornbread and dried venison, practical provisions for the trail, but also a tangible reminder of the evening they had shared. As they stepped onto the porch, the night spread vast and glittering above them. The storm had cleared completely, leaving a sky awash with stars so numerous and brilliant they seemed almost within reach. Their breath fogged in the frigid air, miniature clouds that dissipated into the immensity surrounding them. Travis walked with them to where their horses waited, helping to check cinches and stirrups. The animals had been sheltered in the lean-to beside Spirit, all three seemingly content in each other's company. Sarah mounted first, settling into her saddle with practiced ease. She looked down at Travis, her expression softened by firelight spilling from the cabin windows. Thank you. For dinner. For everything. Her gesture encompassed not just the meal, but the memory wall, the renewed cabin, the evening of cautious reconnection. Michael swung into his saddle more awkwardly, still growing into his adult height. He adjusted his hat, pulling it low against the cold, but his eyes remained visible, clearer than Travis had seen them in years. The angry confusion replaced by something approaching understanding. We'll come back, Michael said simply. Not a question or a tentative suggestion, but a statement of intent. Maybe I could help with that chicken coop, or the path to the creek. Travis felt something expand in his chest, a warmth unrelated to the fire burning inside. I'd like that. They turned their horses toward the trail, Sarah leading the way as she had during their arrival. Before they reached the tree line, Sarah looked back once more at the cabin, at the golden light spilling from its windows, at the straight line of smoke rising from its chimney, at the man standing in its doorway. It really is beautiful, Dad, she called, her voice carrying clear in the still night. What you've built here, what you're still building. Then they were gone, swallowed by the darkness between the pines, only the soft crunch of snow beneath hooves marking their passage. Travis remained on the porch until even that sound faded completely. The cold pressed against him, but he barely noticed its bite. He turned back to the cabin, to the warm light and sheltering walls that had transformed from mere survival to something approaching home. For the first time since returning from war, the future appeared not as a threatening void, but as open terrain, challenging perhaps, but navigable with the right companions and proper tools. Inside, Travis cleared the table, washing the dishes with water warmed by the fire. Each task carried newfound significance, not mere necessity, but acts of care for a space that might someday welcome his children again. He stacked the clean plates on the shelf he'd built specifically for that purpose, straightened the chairs, swept errant crumbs from the floor. Later, as he lay on a sleeping platform, Spirit standing drowsy guard near the hearth, Travis found himself mentally revisiting the evening, cataloging moments of connection, noting where tensions still lingered, planning improvements that would make the cabin more welcoming for future visits. Sleep claimed him, eventually deeper and more restful than he had experienced in years. He dreamed not of battlefield horrors, but of springtime and the mountains of paths being cleared, gardens taking shape, laughter echoing through trees just coming into leaf. Morning dawned clear in brilliant sunlight, transforming the snow-covered clearing into a dazzling expanse that required squinted eyes to navigate. Travis emerged from the cabin to discover fresh tracks crossing the yard a fox had investigated during the night, its delicate prints forming a curious circle around the woodpile before disappearing back into the forest. He filled his lungs with the sharp, clean air, surveying the domain he had reclaimed from ruin. The cabin stood sturdy against the white backdrop, its logs golden in the morning light, its windows reflecting sun rather than sagging empty as they had upon his arrival. Smoke rose straight from the chimney, undisturbed by wind, a signal visible for miles across the valley. Tasks presented themselves naturally. The woodpile needed replenishing, the lean-to required additional reinforcement against accumulated snow. Weight, a broken hinge on the storage chest awaited repair. Travis approached each job methodically, moving from one to the next with the steady purpose that had replaced his earlier desperation. Mid-morning brought unexpected company. A distinctive whistle carried through the trees, Ellis, the freight driver, approaching along the main trail. The wagon appeared moments later, runners replacing wheels for winter travel, the team of horses moving carefully through deep snow. Ellis reined in at the edge of the clearing, raising a hand in greeting. "Morning, Blackwood. Brought those supplies you mentioned needing." The driver's face creased in a knowing smile. "Seems your youngsters made it up here after all." Travis approached the wagon, brushing sawdust from his hands. "They did. Thanks for delivering the invitation." Ellis chuckled, the sound half lost in his thick beard. "Wasn't much delivering needed. Found them already packed and planning the trip when I arrived. Just confirmed what they had already decided." He began unloading items from beneath the wagon's tarp. A sack of cornmeal, coffee beans, a small barrel of nails, a coil of proper rope. Travis helped transfer everything to the porch, then invited Ellis inside to warm up before continuing his route. The driver accepted, gratefully stomping snow from his boots before entering. "Place looks even better than last time I passed through," Ellis observed, moving directly to the fire and extending gnarled hands toward its heat. "Roofs fixed, proper walls standing true. Joseph would approve." Travis poured coffee for them both, the rich aroma filling the cabin. "Still more to do before spring." "Always is." Ellis settled onto the stool, cradling his mug between weathered palms. "But the hard part's done. Got the bones right, everything else is just refinement." He sipped appreciatively, eyes moving toward the memory wall where the daguerreotype held pride of place. "Heard talk in town that you've become quite the topic at Larson's Mercantile." Travis raised an eyebrow, uncertain whether this represented good or bad news. "What kind of talk?" "The wondering kind." Ellis's expression remained neutral, though his eyes held a certain amusement. "Folks who figured you for temporary, taking bets on how long you'd last up here alone. Sheriff setting them straight. Your boy defending your carpentry skills to old Mercer, who claims no cabin built post-1900 is worth the timber used to raise it." The driver gestured toward the carefully joined table. "Wouldn't mind seeing Mercer's face if he could witness this craftsmanship." The notion that Michael had defended his work to others sent an unexpected warmth through Travis. One meal, one evening of tentative reconnection, and already something fundamental had shifted, not just in the privacy of family relations, but in how his son positioned himself publicly in relation to his father. "Jennifer stopped me, too," Ellis continued, watching Travis over the rim of his mug. "Asked how you were faring, whether you needed anything." Travis stilled the mention of his ex-wife's name, opening doors he'd carefully kept closed. "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're building something worth respecting up here." Ellis set his empty mug aside. "Told her you weren't just surviving anymore, you were creating." She seemed relieved. The thought of Jennifer asking after him, concerned despite everything that had transpired between them, despite her upcoming marriage, stirred complicated emotions. Not hope for reconciliation, that chapter had closed for both of them, but perhaps the possibility of something approaching peace. Understanding, even across the distance that now separated their lives. "If you see her again," Travis said carefully, "tell her I'm doing better, that this place is good for me." Ellis nodded, rising to take his leave. "Might tell her yourself next time you're in town. Word is you're overdue for a visit." He buttoned his heavy coat, pulled on gloves stiffened with age and use. "Should make it before the next big snow if you're of a mind to. Almanac says we're due for a real howler end of next week." After Ellis departed, Travis found himself considering the suggestion more seriously than he might have even days earlier. The isolation that had initially drawn him to the cabin, the protective distance from judgment and expectation, no longer seemed as necessary. The work of rebuilding had gradually rebuilt something in himself as well, creating foundations solid enough to withstand the complexities of human connection. He spent the afternoon cutting and splitting additional firewood, preparing for the predicted storm. Spirit kept him company, occasionally disappearing into the trees only to return with pine boughs in his mouth, material Travis had been using to insulate the lean-to walls. The horse's understanding of human intentions sometimes bordered on uncanny, as though he comprehended not just commands, but objectives. "Smart as any ranger I served with," Travis told the Mustang, accepting another branch from his jaws, "and considerably better company." Evening brought spectacular colors, painting the western sky, bands of crimson and gold, spreading across blue, deepening toward indigo. Travis paused in his work to witness the display, conscious that such moments of natural beauty had once passed unnoticed during his darkest periods. The capacity for appreciation had returned gradually, another measure of healing he hadn't recognized until it was already underway. That night, seated at his table with plans spread before him, Travis drafted designs for spring projects: the path to the creek, the vegetable garden on the south slope, the modest chicken coop along the east wall. He sketched with careful attention to detail, measuring proportions against available materials, calculating labor requirements, with the assumption of occasional help, rather than solitary effort. He found himself smiling at the realization he was planning for a future that included others. His children certainly, but perhaps also connections to the wider community. Ellis and Sheriff Haynes had demonstrated that isolation wasn't the only response to trauma. There existed the possibility of rejoining the world without surrendering the peace he'd found in these mountains. The following days established a new rhythm. Travis divided his time between immediate necessities and longer-term improvements. He constructed proper shelving along one wall, organizing supplies with military precision. He fashioned a second chair and stool, anticipating future visitors. He even attempted a crude chess set, carving pieces during evening hours when daylight had faded but sleep remained distant. 5 days after Sarah and Michael's visit, Travis woke to warning signs of the approaching storm Ellis had predicted. The air carried a particular stillness, a heaviness that experienced mountain dwellers recognized as atmospheric pressure building before significant snowfall. Birds had gone unusually quiet, small animals conspicuously absent from their normal routines. He spent the morning securing everything that might be vulnerable, stacking firewood under protective tarps, reinforcing the lean-to, where spirits sheltered, checking the roof for any weaknesses storm winds might exploit. By noon, the western sky had darkened ominously, clouds building in layered formations that promised substantial precipitation. Travis had just finished final preparations when he heard the faint but unmistakable sound of an approaching vehicle laboring through deepening snow. Not Ellis's wagon, which he'd seen just days ago, but something heavier moving with determined purpose despite deteriorating conditions. Moments later, a county maintenance truck appeared at the forest edge, chains on its tires, providing traction in the treacherous conditions. It advanced slowly into the clearing, windshield wipers battling the first swirling flakes of what would soon become blizzard conditions. The driver's door opened, and Sheriff Haynes emerged, collar turned up against the intensifying wind. "Blackwood," he called, raising his voice to carry across the increasingly hostile air. "Thought you might appreciate a ride to town before this system hits full force." "Ellis mentioned you were considering a visit." Travis hesitated, caught between surprise at the offer and uncertainty about leaving the cabin he'd worked so hard to restore. "A storm's already starting. Might be safer to wait it out here." Haynes approached the porch, snow accumulating on his hat and shoulders during the short walk. "Weather Service is calling this the worst system in a decade. 3 feet minimum, possibly twice that at higher elevations, with winds strong enough to snap trees that have stood 100 years. The sheriff's expression remained impassive, but his eyes conveyed the seriousness of the situation. "Your repairs are impressive, but no structure's invulnerable to what's coming." Travis glanced back at the cabin, at the strengthened walls and reinforced roof at the home emerging from what had once been ruin. The prospect of losing it after everything he'd invested, not just labor, but meaning, twisted something deep in his chest. "I can't just abandon it," he protested, the words carrying more emotion than he'd intended to reveal. Haynes studied him with the assessing gaze that seemed to perceive more than just surface appearances. "Not suggesting abandonment, suggesting strategic retreat. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is recognize when holding position means destruction rather than victory. The analogy struck home with unexpected force. How many men had Travis seen die unnecessarily because they refused to yield ground temporarily? How many missions had faltered because pride overruled tactical wisdom? "What about Spirit?" he asked, gesturing toward the lean-to where the Mustang watched their exchange with alert interest. "Got room in the back for him. Brought blankets and extra feed, assuming you'd want him along." Haynes stamped his feet against the gathering cold. "Your children mentioned he goes wherever you go." The revelation that Sarah and Michael had discussed him and Spirit with the sheriff suggested conversations Travis hadn't been privy to, connections maintained even during his self-imposed exile. The thought both humbled and heartened him. Decision made, Travis moved with efficient haste. He gathered essential items, his grandfather's Bible and tools, the photograph and letter from the memory wall, enough clothing for a brief stay. Everything else could remain. The cabin had protected these treasures for decades before his arrival. It would safeguard them a while longer. Spirit submitted to loading with minimal resistance, as though sensing the urgency behind the unusual request. Travis secured the cabin doors and shutters, taking one final look at the structure that had transformed from mere shelter to sanctuary under his hands. "I'll be back," he promised, the words carrying the weight of genuine commitment rather than empty reassurance. The journey to town proved even more difficult than anticipated. Snow fell with increasing intensity, accumulating so rapidly that the truck's passage left only momentary impressions before fresh powder erased all evidence of their trail. Wind gusts rocked the vehicle visibility, narrowing to a tunnel of white directly before the headlights. "Going to be a long recovery after this one." Haynes observed, hands steady on the wheel despite the challenging conditions. County's resources already stretched thin from the December storms. Travis watched the familiar landscape transform into an alien expanse of white landmarks disappearing beneath the relentless accumulation. How are folks in town preparing? As well as can be expected. Stocked up on essentials, securing properties, checking on neighbors. Haynes navigated around a fallen branch, partially blocking their path. "Your Jennifer's been organizing supplies at the community center. Emergency shelter for anyone who might need it." The casual "your Jennifer" caught Travis off guard, a reminder of connections that persisted despite legal dissolution. He chose not to correct the sheriff, instead focusing on the more relevant information. "The community center's roof was questionable last time I saw it. Heavy snow load could cause problems." Haynes nodded without taking his eyes from the treacherous road. "Assessment team flagged it last month, but county funds for repair won't be available until spring. Best we can do is monitor and clear accumulation as it builds." They lapsed into silence as the storm intensified, requiring Haynes's complete concentration to navigate safely. Travis found himself mentally calculating what would be needed to reinforce the center's roof materials. Labor hours approached strategies, given the building's design. The process felt natural, an extension of skills rediscovered during his work on the cabin. Dry Creek emerged from the whiteout conditions like a ship materializing through fog, scattered lights, marking human presence in the growing darkness. The town comprised only a few streets organized around a central square, its buildings representing various eras of Western development, from original log structures to more modern constructions. Haynes guided the truck toward the community center, a repurposed church whose broad windows glowed with warmth against the gathering storm. "Thought you might want to stable your horse first, then we can figure where you'll be staying." Inside the attached stable, they found several other horses already secured in preparation for the blizzard. Travis led Spirit to an empty stall, removing tack and rubbing him down with dry blankets. The Mustang seemed unsettled by the unfamiliar surroundings, ears flicking nervously at each new sound. "It's temporary," Travis assured him, providing fresh water and hay. "Just until the worst passes." He stroked the strong neck, feeling the muscles gradually relax beneath his touch. "We've weathered worse together, haven't we?" With Spirit settled, Travis followed Haynes into the community center proper. The building hummed with purposeful activity, volunteers arranging cots along the walls, checking supply inventories, establishing communication protocols. Most faces were unfamiliar, but a few registered recognition as Travis entered conversations, momentarily pausing before resuming with greater intensity. He was still adjusting to the overwhelming sensory input, the first large enclosed space with multiple people he'd experienced in Bunsuan, when a familiar voice cut through the background noise. "Dad." Sarah emerged from a side room clipboard in hand, surprise evident in her expression. "What are you doing here?" Before Travis could respond, Michael appeared behind his sister, arms full of blankets ready for distribution. He stopped short at the sight of his father, eyes widening. "Sheriff Haynes convinced me the cabin might not be the safest place to ride out this particular storm." Travis explained, suddenly self-conscious of his appearance after the difficult journey. "Thought I might be more useful down here." Sarah glanced between Travis and the sheriff, understanding dawning. "You went all the way up there to get him, in these conditions." Haynes shrugged the gesture, dismissing any suggestion of extraordinary effort. "Was headed that direction anyway. Road check." The obvious fabrication delivered with such matter-of-fact confidence that challenging it seemed pointless. Michael set down his burden and approached relief evident beneath his attempt at casual greeting. "Glad you made it before the roads closed completely. They're saying this could last 3 days or more." "Your horse okay?" Sarah asked, practical concern overriding any awkwardness at this unexpected reunion. Travis nodded. "Stabled him out back. He's not thrilled about the arrangement, but he'll manage." An uncomfortable silence threatened to descend three people with too much history and too little recent practice at ordinary conversation. Haynes broke the impasse with characteristic directness. "Blackwood here was just expressing concerns about the structural integrity of this roof under heavy snow load. Thought his carpentry experience might prove useful in monitoring potential stress points." Sarah brightened, visibly grateful for the redirection toward practical matters. "We definitely need help with that. The county inspector said the trusses over the main hall are showing signs of weakness, but nobody seems to know exactly what to watch for." Just like that, Travis found himself with purpose, a defined role that utilized his skills while smoothing the social complexities of his sudden reappearance in town life. Sarah led him toward the area of greatest concern, explaining what information they had already gathered, her manner shifting from daughter to cable coordinator. The inspection confirmed Travis's suspicions. Several key structural elements showed signs of deterioration that, while not immediately dangerous under normal conditions, created significant vulnerability during extreme weather events. He outlined his findings to Sarah, who took detailed notes. "So basically, we need to establish a snow-clearing rotation for the roof and monitor these specific points for any signs of increasing stress." She summarized, already formulating an action plan. Travis nodded, impressed by her quick comprehension. "Exactly. 4-hour intervals should be sufficient unless accumulation rates increase dramatically. I can take the first shift once the storm hits full force." Their conversation attracted attention from other volunteers who gathered to hear Travis's assessment. He found himself explaining structural principles in layman's terms, drawing simple diagrams to illustrate potential problem areas, answering questions with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. Throughout the impromptu briefing, he remained acutely aware of Michael, watching from nearby, his expression thoughtful rather than guarded. When the group dispersed to implement the recommended precautions, Michael approached with 2 mugs of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he offered, extending one steaming cup. "Been a long journey from the mountains." Travis accepted gratefully, the small gesture carrying significance beyond the practical refreshment. "Thanks. How long have you and Sarah been volunteering here?" "Since yesterday, when the weather service upgraded the warning." Michael leaned against a nearby table, his posture more relaxed than Travis had witnessed in years. "Mom's been coordinating everything. She's in the kitchen now, organizing meal preparation for what could be a lot of stranded people." The casual reference to Jennifer sent a jolt of awareness through Travis. Of course she would be here. This was her community, her natural role in times of crisis. The prospect of their first face-to-face encounter in nearly a year both unsettled and intrigued him. What version of himself would she see? Now, what version of herself might he discover? "Should probably let her know you're here," Michael continued, watching his father closely, "before you run into each other unexpectedly." Travis nodded, recognizing the wisdom in the suggestion. Some conversations benefited from preparation rather than surprise. "I will. Just need to finish documenting these stress points first." He completed his assessment methodically, marking areas that would require regular monitoring, establishing baseline measurements against which to compare any changes. The familiar process of problem-solving provided welcome focus, allowing him to postpone the more complex emotional challenges awaiting him. The postponement proved shorter than anticipated. As Travis compiled his notes at a corner table, a hush fell over the nearby volunteers. their sudden silence drawing his attention. He looked up to find Jennifer standing in the doorway between the main hall and kitchen area, her expression a complex mixture of surprise and something less easily defined. She looked both familiar and changed her hair shorter than he remembered, silver strands now prominent at her temples, her posture carrying the confidence that had always been her hallmark. She wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, rather than the professional attire that had once defined her workdays, practical clothing for practical circumstances. Travis rose slowly, uncertain of proper protocol for this moment neither of them had anticipated. The distance between them, physical, emotional, temporal, seemed simultaneously vast and insignificant, years of shared history compressed into a single loaded glance. Jennifer crossed the room with deliberate steps, stopping at a distance that acknowledged both their past intimacy and present separation. "Travis, Sheriff Haynes mentioned he was bringing you down from the cabin." Her voice carried the same clarity he remembered, direct without being harsh, controlled without being cold. Travis found himself standing straighter, responding to her presence, as he always had, with a sense that she saw him completely without illusion or embellishment. "Storm looks serious enough to warrant temporary relocation," he explained, gesturing toward the notes he'd been compiling. "Thought I might make myself useful while I'm here." Jennifer glanced at his diagrams, recognition flickering across her features. "You're assessing the roof integrity. I should have thought of that earlier." "Oh, Sarah's already organizing monitoring teams based on the vulnerable points we've identified." Travis indicated their daughter across the room, efficiently briefing volunteers on their responsibilities. "She's good at this, coordinating people, maintaining focus under pressure." A small smile softened Jennifer's expression. "She gets that from you, you know, the ability to function clearly during crisis." I always became emotional, first practical, second. The simple acknowledgement that she still recognized his positive contributions to their children, despite everything that had gone wrong, eased something tight in Travis's chest. She mentioned forestry programs. For college. Jennifer nodded, some internal tension visibly releasing at this shift toward neutral shared territory. "It surprised me at first. I always pictured her following an academic track, maybe law like my sister. But seeing her these past months, how she comes alive in outdoor settings." She shrugged lightly. "She knows her own mind better than I gave her credit for." Their conversation might have continued to awkwardness, gradually yielding to the familiar rhythm of co-parenting, had the lights not chosen that moment to flicker ominously. The building fell silent as everyone registered the implication: power infrastructure beginning to fail as the storm intensified. Emergency protocols activated immediately. Volunteers moved with practiced efficiency, lighting, lanterns, and battery-powered alternatives, securing essential communications equipment, implementing contingency plans. Jennifer turned toward the kitchen, priorities shifting instantly from personal reconnection to community crisis management. "We need to verify generator fuel levels," she called to a nearby volunteer, "and begin conserving perishable food supplies in case refrigeration becomes unreliable." Travis found himself automatically integrating into the response effort, years of military training asserting themselves in the methodical identification and addressing of potential hazards. He coordinated with several men to secure loose exterior elements that might become projectiles in high winds, then helped establish a sheltered pathway between the main building and stable to ensure animals could be tended safely. The lights failed completely within the hour, plunging the community center into lantern-illuminated dimness, punctuated by the howl of wind forcing its way through every tiny gap in the century-old structure. Outside, snow accumulated with alarming speed, already knee-deep and rising steadily. The temperature plummeted as night fell, transforming windows into frosted panes that creaked under the assault of elements. Travis organized the first roof-clearing team, demonstrating proper technique for removing accumulation without creating unbalanced loads that might compromise structural integrity. Despite exhaustion from his journey and the day's activities, he took the first monitoring shift himself, checking measurement points hourly and documenting any changes with meticulous precision. The center gradually transformed from emergency preparation hub to actual shelter as community members unable to remain in their homes arrived seeking warmth and safety. Each new group brought fresh reports of conditions deteriorating throughout the town: power lines, down roads, impassable pipes freezing in older buildings. Travis worked continuously, moving from one urgent task to the next without complaint or hesitation. He repaired a broken shutter threatening to tear free in the wind, helped establish a more efficient heating arrangement, using the wood stoves and reinforced a door frame buckling under pressure differentials created by the storm. It was nearly midnight when Sarah found him adjusting guy wires on the radio antenna, the community's last reliable communication link with county emergency services. She carried a steaming mug and a plate of sandwiches, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration. "You need to rest," she insisted, offering the provisions. "You've been working nonstop since you arrived." Travis accepted the food gratefully, suddenly aware of hunger he'd been ignoring for hours. "Just trying to make myself useful." Sarah studied him in the harsh illumination of the battery-powered work light, seeing perhaps more clearly than she had in years. "It's more than that," she observed quietly. "This is who you've always been, isn't it? The person who steps forward when things fall apart, who builds what needs building and fixes what needs fixing." The simple recognition that his daughter might be seeing his essential nature rather than just the damaged version of himself that had dominated recent years filled Travis with unexpected emotion. "Not always. For a while I was the broken thing that couldn't be fixed." Sarah's gaze remained steady, neither flinching from difficult truth nor allowing it to define everything. "Maybe you just needed the right tools and enough quiet to hear yourself think." She left him to his meal and maintenance work, but the conversation lingered, offering perspective Travis hadn't fully articulated even to himself. Perhaps the cabin hadn't merely been escape or isolation. Perhaps it had been necessary recalibration, the space and time required to rediscover capabilities buried beneath trauma, but never truly destroyed. The night deepened, storm intensifying to near whiteout conditions visible through windows briefly cleared of frost. Travis completed essential exterior maintenance, then moved inside to check roof stress points. The measurements remained within acceptable parameters, but several areas showed concerning trends that would require intervention if snow continued accumulating at current rates. He was calculating load distributions for potential reinforcement when Michael appeared beside him, face drawn with fatigue, but determined. "Mom says you've been up for nearly 24 hours straight." His tone carried the stubborn concern Travis recognized from Jennifer. "There are cots set up in the back room. You should get some sleep while you can." Travis shook his head, indicating his calculations. "Need to design reinforcement for these trusses first. Weights increasing faster than clearing teams can manage." Michael studied the diagrams with unexpected comprehension. "You're thinking cross-bracing with additional support points distributed along these spans." Not a question, but an accurate assessment of Travis's approach. Travis looked up, surprised. "You understand structural engineering?" A faint flush colored Michael's cheeks. "I've been taking advanced physics. The principles aren't that different." He gestured toward the calculations. "But you've transposed these figures. The load distribution changes if you account for wind direction creating uneven accumulation on the east-facing sections." Travis rechecked his work, discovering Michael was correct. The error wasn't catastrophic, but would have resulted in suboptimal reinforcement placement. "Good catch. Where did you learn to spot that kind of mistake?" "Mom always says, check your assumptions before your calculations." Michael shrugged, embarrassment mingling with pride at his father's evident respect. "And I've been watching you work all day. You pay attention to details most people don't even notice." The simple observation that his son had been studying him, learning from him even without direct instruction, affected Travis more deeply than any praise could have. This was legacy in its most fundamental form, knowledge transferring across generations through observation and example rather than formal teaching. "Tell you what," Travis offered, making a decision that honored both his responsibility and his son's emerging capabilities. "Help me finish these calculations and implement the first round of reinforcements. Then we'll both get some rest while the next team takes over monitoring." Working together, they completed the structural assessment with unexpected efficiency, Michael's theoretical knowledge complementing Travis's practical experience. They moved from diagrams to actual installation, securing additional bracing at key stress points throughout the main hall. The process required physical strength, spatial reasoning, and problem-solving challenges. Michael met with growing confidence under his father's guidance. By the time they finished, the earliest hints of dawn were attempting to penetrate the storm's fury, not actual light, but the faintest lessening of darkness at the windows. The community center had settled into the rhythm of crisis management volunteers rotating through essential duties, while those not actively engaged rested in preparation for their shifts. Travis followed Michael toward the back room, where cots had been arranged for temporary sleeping quarters. He paused in the doorway, struck by an unexpected sight: Sarah curled on a cot near the wall, fast asleep, despite the commotion elsewhere in the building. Beside her, sitting upright in a chair with a book open on her lap, but eyes closed in exhausted slumber, was Jennifer. The tableau presented a version of family he hadn't witnessed in years. Mother and daughter connected even in unconsciousness, sharing space and vulnerability without reservation. He stood motionless, unwilling to disturb the peaceful scene, yet unable to look away. Michael touched his arm lightly, understanding evident in his expression. "There's space over here," he whispered, indicating several empty cots along the opposite wall. "Mom's been up as long as you have. She finally crashed about an hour ago while watching over Sarah." Travis nodded, following his son to the designated area. The simple cots offered better rest than he'd initially experienced at the cabin, a thought that brought both amusement and perspective. He settled onto the thin mattress, removing only his boots before stretching out, fully clothed, prepared to respond quickly if needed. Michael took the adjacent cot, mirroring his father's preparation. The parallel wasn't lost on Travis, the son unconsciously adopting the readiness posture of the father, maintaining vigilance, even in rest. "Thanks for your help today." Travis offered quietly, the words inadequate for the deeper acknowledgement he wished to convey. "You've got a good eye for structural issues." Michael lay back, staring at the ceiling, illuminated by a single battery lantern on a nearby table. It felt good, doing something real, something that matters. He hesitated, then added softly, "Is that how it feels for you? Working on the cabin?" Travis considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes, but it's more than just the physical building. It's connecting to something larger than myself, to history, to legacy, to purpose beyond just survival." Michael was silent so long, Travis thought he might have fallen asleep. Then, barely audible, "I think I understand that now. What you were trying to tell us that day we first visited. About how the work helps you heal." The simple statement contained worlds of meaning: acknowledgement of past misunderstanding, recognition of present connection, possibility of future comprehension. Travis felt its significance resonating through layers of accumulated distance and hurt, creating space for something new to emerge. "Get some sleep," he advised gently. "Storm's not finished with us yet." As fatigue claimed him, Travis remained aware of his surroundings in a way that differed fundamentally from his hypervigilance of previous years. This awareness arose not from fear, but from connection to his children sleeping nearby, to the community sheltering together against common threat, to his own reclaimed capacity for meaningful contribution. The storm raged for 3 more days, testing structures and spirits throughout Dry Creek. Travis alternated between rest and intensive labor, joining teams clearing snow from vulnerable rooftops, reinforcing buildings, showing signs of stress, ensuring paths remained open between essential services. He worked alongside townspeople who initially regarded him with caution, but gradually accepted his presence and expertise. Sheriff Haynes often paired him with local ranchers and builders for particularly challenging tasks, creating natural opportunities for reintegration into community rhythms without forcing artificial social interactions. Sarah and Michael remained deeply involved in relief efforts, their responsibilities expanding as they demonstrated competence beyond their years. Travis observed them with quiet pride, noting how each had developed strengths that complemented their personalities. Sarah's natural leadership and decisive action, Michael's analytical problem-solving and attention to overlooked details. Interactions with Jennifer evolved from initial awkwardness into functional partnership as crisis demands superseded personal history. They found themselves able to communicate effectively about practical matters, their shared concern for community welfare, and their children's well-being, providing common ground that personal reconciliation might never have achieved. On the 4th morning, residents woke to unaccustomed silence. The howling wind finally exhausted the relentless snowfall. Ceased, sunlight penetrated clouds for the first time in days, transforming the devastated landscape into a dazzling expanse that momentarily disguised the extent of damage beneath its pristine surface. Travis joined the initial assessment team, surveying conditions throughout town with Haynes and several county officials. The destruction proved substantial, but not catastrophic. Numerous structures damaged, but most repairable essential services compromised. But recoverable community bonds tested, but ultimately strengthened by collective response. When they reached the trail leading toward his cabin, Travis felt conflicting impulses, concern for the structure he'd poured so much into, yet reluctance to separate himself again from the human connections reestablished during the crisis. The path remained completely impassable. Snow drifted higher than a man's head in some sections, trees fallen across other segments. Going to be at least a week before anyone can get up there safely. Haynes observed, reading Travis's thoughts. Longer without proper equipment and manpower. Travis nodded, accepting the reality with surprising equanimity. Cabin stood through worse. It can wait. They returned to the community center, now transitioning from emergency shelter to recovery headquarters. Volunteers cataloged damages reported throughout the county, prioritizing responses based on severity and available resources. Travis found himself naturally integrating into these efforts, offering practical suggestions for repairs and identifying which structures required immediate attention versus those where temporary measures would suffice. Late afternoon found him helping stabilize the Mercantile's compromise awning when a familiar voice called his name. He turned to find Jennifer approaching, clipboard in hand, her expression businesslike but not unwelcoming. The council's organizing repair teams for critical infrastructure, she explained without preamble. They're looking for someone to coordinate structural assessment and prioritization. Sheriff Haynes suggested you. The request represented more than mere practical need. It constituted invitation back into community function, acknowledgement of skills and trustworthiness that transcended his period of isolation. Travis recognized its significance without requiring elaboration. Happy to help however I can, he responded simply. Jennifer nodded, making a notation on her clipboard. There's also the matter of your accommodations until the mountain road's clear. Sarah and Michael have been staying with me since the semester ended. We have a spare room if that wouldn't be too awkward. The offer carried its own complexity, practical solution to immediate need, yet fraught with potential discomfort given their history and her upcoming marriage. Travis considered declining, seeking alternative arrangements to avoid complicating an already complex situation. Before he could respond, Jennifer continued with characteristic directness. The children would like you there, and frankly, it makes coordinating recovery efforts more efficient if key personnel aren't scattered across town. Her framing provided dignified rationale that acknowledged family connections without overemphasizing emotional aspects. Travis recognized and appreciated the careful balance she'd struck. If you're sure it won't cause problems, he agreed cautiously. I wouldn't want to impose or create difficulties with your fiancé. A brief smile touched Jennifer's lips, surprising in its genuine amusement. Richard's stranded in Denver until flights resume, and he's remarkably free of the insecurities you might be projecting. He suggested the arrangement himself when we spoke by satellite phone this morning. The gentle rebuke contained no malice, merely correction of assumption. Travis accepted it with a nod, recognizing that his ex-wife had indeed moved forward in ways that deserve respect rather than complication. Then I accept with thanks. He gestured toward the Mercantile's partially repaired awning. Let me finish securing this, and I'll gather my things from the community center. That evening, Travis found himself seated at a kitchen table that had once been the center of his family life, sharing a simple meal with his children, while storm recovery reports played on a battery-powered radio nearby. The familiar setting highlighted both what had been lost and what remained possible, not restoration of what was, but perhaps creation of something new that honored, rather than erased their shared history. Sarah described volunteer coordination challenges with animated detail, her natural leadership having flourished during the crisis. Michael contributed more measured observations about infrastructure vulnerabilities revealed by the storm, his analytical mind already formulating improvement suggestions for future resilience. Travis listened more than he spoke, absorbing the evidence of who his children were becoming, recognizing threads of connection between their developing strengths and potentials he'd glimpsed in the cabin's quiet sanctuary. The physical distance that had separated them had perhaps provided space for growth, that constant proximity might have stunted, a bittersweet realization that their time apart, while painful, had not been without unexpected benefits. Later, as they prepared for sleep in a house gradually warming as power returned to sections of town, Travis paused at the spare room window. From this vantage point, he could just make out the mountain ridge line where his cabin stood still, inaccessible, but present on the horizon, a reminder of the sanctuary that had facilitated his healing and the connections that gave that healing meaning. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her expression thoughtful as she followed his gaze toward the distant peaks. "You're thinking about the cabin," she observed quietly. Travis nodded, not bothering to deny the obvious. Wondering how it weathered the storm, she moved to stand beside him, her shoulder nearly touching his arm, a proximity that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "We could help you check on it when the road's clear. Maybe stay a few days if you wanted company." The casual offer contained worlds of significance, an acknowledgement of the cabin's importance to him, willingness to share that space, recognition that their relationship had evolved beyond the anger and confusion of previous encounters. "I'd like that," Travis responded, simply, the words containing all the emotion he couldn't fully articulate. Sarah nodded, comfortable with the understated exchange that conveyed more than effusive declarations might have achieved. "I've been thinking about that sign for the path to the creek. Maybe something carved from cedar, it resists weathering better than pine." Travis smiled, recognizing the inherited tendency toward practical planning as a bridge between generations. "Your great-grandfather would approve of that material choice. He always said choose your wood for the conditions it must face, not just for how easily it works." Sarah's expression brightened at this connection to family legacy she was only beginning to discover. "Tell me more about him. About all of them, really. I feel like I'm only now learning who we come from." As night deepened over the snow-transformed landscape, father and daughter spoke quietly of ancestors whose lives had shaped the very ground beneath their feet, of Joseph's craftsmanship that built half the town, of Catherine's fierce determination during harsh pioneer winters, of connections stretching backward through time and forward into possibility. Outside the community of Dry Creek began its slow recovery, neighbors helping neighbors clear paths and repair damages. Inside, a different kind of reconstruction continued. One built not of timber and nails, but of shared stories, of acknowledged hurts, of cautious hope, extending like tender green shoots through the cracks of what had once seemed irreparably broken. Morning would bring new challenges, practical problems requiring immediate solutions. But something fundamental had shifted during these days of crisis and connection. The cabin on the mountainside remained Travis's sanctuary, the place where healing had begun. But healing, he now understood, couldn't reach completion in isolation. It required the very connections he had once fled, the complicated, demanding, essential bonds of family and community that gave purpose to individual struggle. As Travis finally settled toward sleep, he felt neither the hypervigilance of his worst periods nor the exhausted numbness that had often followed. Instead, he experienced something approaching peace, the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who recognizes that his work, while far from complete, has established foundations solid enough to build upon with confidence. Not just a cabin reconstructed, but a life. Not just survival, but the beginnings of genuine restoration.